Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. The summer I turned 18, my cousins and I decided to spend the weekend at their grandparents' old farm. The house was on the edge of a small, sleepy town, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles and a patch of forest on one side. I had spent summers there when I was younger, but this time felt different. The place was darker. Somehow, even in the middle of the day, we arrived around mid-afternoon. The farm had a rusted, creaky metal gate that looked like it might fall apart if you touched it, and the paint on the house was chipped and faded. It had been a while since anyone had taken care of it. After we settled in, we explored the property, climbing trees, poking around the old barn, and chasing each other through the long grass. The scent of hay and earth clung to the air, sweet and sharp dot. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky deepened into a rich, bruised blue. That was when we noticed the sound. It started as a low rumble from the woods behind the house, like the growl of distant thunder. But it wasn't quite right. It had a steady, pulsing rhythm to it, almost like footsteps. We looked at each other, nervous laughter escaping us as we tried to dismiss it. Probably just some wild animal, my cousin Peter said, though his voice wavered. But the noise grew louder, and we started hearing whispers, thin and rustling, coming from the woods. It was then that I realized there was a pattern to the noise, like someone was walking through the underbrush, trying to stay hidden but failing. We huddled together, trying to make sense of it. I was about to suggest we go back inside when the air turned colder, and a shadow fell across the yard. A figure stepped out of the forest. It was thin and bent, its limbs moving in jerky motions, like a marionette with tangled strings. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, and its face came into view. It was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that were dark pits, as if they had been carved out. A low, rasping breath escaped its mouth, and it tilted its head, like it was studying us. Double quotes run. I whispered. We bolted for the house, hearts pounding in our chests. I could hear the figure shuffling behind us, the leaves crunching underfoot. We slammed the door shut, the lock clicking into place just as the figure reached it. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a sharp, scraping sound, like nails dragging down the door. We huddled in the dark, staring at the thin sliver of light under the door. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. I felt a rush of cold air move across my skin, as though something was just inches away. The sound of scraping shifted to a loud thump. And then it stopped. We dared to breathe again, the fear making us dizzy. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My cousins whispered about calling for help, but the landline in the kitchen was dead, the cord frayed and hanging limply. Suddenly, a soft knock came from the back door. Peter glanced at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "It's inside." We moved as a group to the kitchen, every step echoing in the silent house. I peeked through the cracked door, and the sight made my blood freeze. The figure was standing on the porch, staring at us through the glass. It didn't move, didn't blink. But then, its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and it spoke in a voice like wind through dead branches. "You shouldn't have come back." We backed away, the noise of the night outside pressing in around us. The whispers returned, but this time, they were joined by a second voice, then a third. Shapes began to form in the windows, figures pressing their faces against the glass, eyes black and hollow. The next thing I remember is waking up in the middle of the yard at dawn, the others scattered around me. The house was silent, its doors and windows closed, as if nothing had happened. We checked every room, but there was no sign of the figures, no sound at all. But when I went to the window and looked out at the woods, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. And I knew that, whatever had been there, it hadn't left. The old amusement park had been abandoned for years, but I still remembered the stories. Tales of children who had gone missing, strange laughter echoing through the empty rides, and the ghost of the clown who would appear when the wind was just right. It was mostly local legend, but when my friends suggested we visit at midnight, I couldn't resist. There were 5 of us, me, Liam, Sophie, Rosa, and Mark, we parked by the rusted entrance, the iron gates hanging crooked and covered in ivy. The moon cast a pale glow over the place, illuminating the cracked pavement and twisted, metal rides that had once delighted hundreds of people. Now, they loomed like broken skeletons. "Are you sure this is safe?" Rosa asked, clutching her jacket around her. "It's just an old park," Mark said, his voice wavering with nervous excitement. What could happen? We wandered through the main entrance, the gravel crunching underfoot. The air was dense with the scent of old popcorn and the faint metallic tang of rust. My flashlight cut through the dark, landing on the broken Ferris wheel towering above us, its seat swaying in the wind. A low creak echoed as if it were groaning in its sleep. We decided to start with the haunted house. It was a small, decrepit building with peeling paint and shutters that flapped in the breeze. I pushed open the splintered door, and it let out a low, mournful moan. Inside, the darkness was suffocating, the air damp and cold. My flashlight barely cut through it, casting jagged beams across cracked mirrors and plastic skeletons. As we crept deeper into the maze of twisted halls, I noticed the whispers. They were soft at first, like the wind blowing through the building. Then they grew louder, more distinct, until it sounded like children giggling just around the corner. "Did you hear that?" Liam asked, voice tight with fear. "Probably just the wind," I replied, though my own voice sounded uncertain. But when we rounded the corner, we saw a clown in the corner of the room, sitting on a broken stool. It was more than just a mannequin, it was moving. The painted smile was chipped and cracked, revealing teeth that looked unnaturally sharp. Its eyes, hollow and dark, fixed on us. Liam gasped, but before any of us could scream, a loud crash came from behind. We spun around, my heart thundering in my chest. The hallway was empty, but something in the corner caught my eye, a pair of small, muddy shoes, too small for any adult. Then the giggling started again, louder this time, and we bolted. We stumbled out into the night, tripping over debris and each other. Behind us, the laughter followed, echoing through the park like a chorus. The clown was nowhere in sight, but we didn't dare look back. We sprinted to the entrance, but it was no longer there. The iron gates had vanished, replaced by the dark, brambled forest that surrounded the park. The laughter still rang out, coming from every direction now. My flashlight flickered, and in the cold glow, I saw them children, dressed in tattered clothes, eyes wide and empty, standing in the shadows. Mark screamed as one of them stepped forward, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it was the same pair of muddy shoes. The children were staring at us, their faces blank, but there was no mistaking their intent. They moved toward us, slow at first, then faster, their little feet pattering against the ground like raindrops. I grabbed Rose's hand and pulled her with me as we ran. We didn't stop until we burst out of the woods and into the clearing where the main road lay. Behind us, the laughter still called, fading slowly as we put distance between ourselves and the park. When we turned back, the amusement park was gone. The moonlight shone on an empty field. That was the last time I ever saw it, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint laughter echoing in the distance and know they're still waiting. Eyes watching, feet pattering closer with every passing second. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. My friends and I wanted to escape the relentless heat and the city's hum. We set out for a hike in the hills, a few hours away from town. The path was familiar to us, winding between ancient oaks and fields of wild flowers. We'd gone there many times before. This time, though, something felt off. By mid-afternoon, the sunlight was golden and warm. We were a group of 5, all laughing and joking as we made our way up a narrow trail that led to a small, abandoned lookout tower. When we reached the tower, we stopped for a break. One friend, Nora, climbed up and peered over the railing, her hair wild from the climb. "Hey, you guys need to see this," she called. We gathered around, squinting as she pointed to something in the distance. There was a clearing, bordered by dense trees. A small, gray house sat in the middle of it, something I'd never seen before. "Did you know there was a house out there?" I asked. Nobody had. We all turned to look at each other, the air suddenly cooler. "Let's check it out," Nora said, eyes sparkling with the thrill of the unknown. We hiked down the trail, stepping over roots and skirting patches of brambles. The house loomed ahead, looking more derelict with each step. Its paint was peeling, windows cracked and dark. It was as if time had swallowed it, leaving only a husk behind. We stood in front of the door, hesitant but curious. The wooden frame was warped, and the doorknob was rusted. With a push, it swung open, creaking like a giant's groan. Inside, the air was cold and damp. Dust lay thick on the wooden floor, and the furniture was covered in white sheets that made it look like a ghost home. As we explored, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread, like someone was watching us from the shadows. I looked at my friends, who were laughing and chattering, oblivious to the strange feeling in the air. Then, I heard it. A faint tapping from above, like someone walking around in the attic. My skin prickled, and I glanced at Nora, who met my eyes and looked away quickly, pretending she hadn't heard it. Probably just a raccoon, Sam said, shrugging, though he wasn't quite as carefree as he sounded. I didn't believe him, but I didn't want to be the one to ruin the moment. We made our way up the creaky staircase, the sound of our steps echoing through the empty house. The attic door stood ajar at the top. A dark slit of blackness. Nora hesitated but pushed it open. The air was sharp and carried the scent of mildew. Inside, the room was cluttered with old trunks and broken furniture. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. There, in the far corner, was a rocking chair, moving back and forth as though it had just been disturbed. I stepped forward, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The chair stilled, and an icy chill rushed through the room. I turned to my friends to say something, but before I could, the sound of footsteps thumped behind me. We spun around, and my heart stopped. A figure stood at the bottom of the stairs. It was a woman, hair matted and dark, eyes hollow and wide. She didn't say a word, but her stare was enough. The silent scream of it etched into my mind. Nora grabbed my arm, yanking me back as the figure stepped forward, voice rasping like broken glass. Leave. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran down the stairs, out of the house, and back into the woods. The air grew warmer as we fled, the cold behind us fading into the distance. When we reached the trailhead, panting and wild-eyed, we turned back. The house was gone, swallowed by the trees, as if it had never been there at all. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest floor. That we never spoke of what happened that day, but every so often, when I find myself out on a hike, I swear I hear the faint sound of a rocking chair in the distance, moving back and forth in the dark. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening with friends at my cousin's house. The kind of night where you sit in the living room, eat snacks, and play video games until someone falls asleep on the couch. But that night, the house was anything but ordinary. My cousin lived in an old colonial house at the edge of town. It creaked and groaned with age, the kind of house that made you think it might have secrets. The front door was painted a faded blue, and the wood floors had dark patches from years of use. I loved the place, despite the occasional chill in the air and the way the windows rattled when the wind picked up. That night, the wind was more than picking up, it was howling. We were in the middle of a game when the lights flickered. Just a brief dimming, a heartbeat of shadow, before the house returned to its usual glow. I barely noticed it, too busy focused on not losing the game. My cousin, Mark, glanced at the living room window. Frowning, "You guys hear that?" he asked, his voice slow. We all paused. The wind outside had grown louder, a deep, almost animal growl that sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, a loud bang came from upstairs, like a heavy piece of furniture had been knocked over, probably just the wind. Sarah, another friend, said, but her voice was tight. The others nodded, but the room felt 10 degrees colder. Mark got up and hesitated at the base of the stairs, peering up into the darkness. "I'll check it out," he said, trying to sound casual. I didn't want to be left alone with the noise, so I stood and followed him. We crept up the stairs, every creak of the wood making us wince. The hallway was dark, lit only by the dim glow of the moon through the window. Mark reached for the light switch, but paused midair when a low, guttural growl came from inside his bedroom. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The hair on my arm stood up. I nodded, unable to speak. Mark took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the room was empty. The window was closed, but the curtains billowed as if stirred by an invisible hand. The noise had stopped. "Nothing here," he said, though his voice sounded unsure. I stepped in, and then it happened something I'll never forget. The dresser at the far end of the room began to move. It shuddered and scraped across the floor, pulling away from the wall with a sound that set my teeth on edge. I froze as the dresser tilted sideways, then crashed to the floor. What in the... Mark started, but the words died in his throat as we both heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps coming from down the hallway. We didn't wait to see what was coming. We sprinted out of the room, charging past the others who were now gathered at the bottom of the stairs. There was no time to explain. We needed to get out. Mark's parents were on a trip, and they had left us the keys to the old car parked in the driveway. I grabbed the keys from the hook by the door and threw open the front door. The wind rushed in, howling like it had something to say, but we didn't look back. We slammed the car doors shut and I fumbled to start it, the engine sputtering in protest before roaring to life. As we pulled out onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood still, dark and silent, but there was something wrong. In one of the windows, a shadow moved, a figure standing there, watching. Its shape was tall, thin, and it had eyes that glowed with a pale, cold light. I took a deep breath and looked away, gripping the steering wheel until my fingers ached. None of us spoke, but we didn't need to. We all knew we wouldn't be returning there again. It wasn't just the wind that had been howling that night. The growls had come from inside the house itself. The last thing I expected that evening was to be running for my life through an overgrown field under a moonless sky. I had been looking forward to the autumn festival, the kind that brought the community together with hay rides, cider, and bonfires. It was supposed to be a night of fun. But that changed the moment I wandered away from the festival grounds and into the nearby woods. I'd gone to explore, curious about the stories old-timers whispered about the forgotten field. It was said to be cursed, a place where people who entered never returned. I was skeptical, of course. After all, it was just an old patch of land, overgrown with tall grasses and brambles. I wanted to see it for myself, prove to my friends that the legends were just that, legends. The first sign that I had gone too far came when I stepped into the field and heard the distant sound of footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the crunching of leaves and the rustle of grass blending together. But then I heard it again, soft, deliberate steps, as though someone were pacing just out of sight. I turned around, but the field was empty. A chill ran down my spine as the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent. It reminded me of blood, sharp and coppery, but I told myself it was just the smell of the forest. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the dim light from the festival. It was tall, tall. Its limbs were elongated, thin, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were studying me. The face was obscured, hidden under a tangle of shadow. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Before I could run, it moved. The figure glided across the field with a speed that was impossible for a human. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the uneven ground as I made my way back to the festival. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would burst. A sound, like something wet being dragged, followed close behind me. I dared not look back, but I could hear it, feel it gaining on me. I leapt over a fallen branch and stumbled, my hands scraping against the rough earth. When I scrambled to my feet, I was closer to the woods than the festival, but the figure had stopped. It was standing there, watching, unmoving. The wind blew again, and with it came a whisper that sent a jolt of terror down my spine. It was low, raspy, and spoke a single word: run. I didn't think twice. My legs carried me forward, back toward the lights and laughter of the festival. I didn't look behind me until I reached the safety of the crowd, gasping and panting. I spun around and saw nothing but the night, the field, and the edge of the woods. But the whispers didn't stop. They continued, coming from the shadows at the edge of the field, repeating that same, terrible word: run. I grabbed my friends and tried to tell them what happened. They laughed it off, thinking I was drunk or imagining things. But when they saw the scratches on my arms and the terrified look in my eyes, their laughter faded. The festival ended soon after, with people leaving the area in droves. As we walked back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The field was empty, but something in the darkness shifted. I could see the silhouette of a figure, staring, unmoving, as if waiting for me to leave. I haven't been back to the festival since, and I never will. They say that if you see the forgotten field and hear the whispers, you're never truly safe. It's still out there, lurking, waiting to call you back. I never thought a simple trip to the county fair would lead to a night I couldn't forget. The fairgrounds were full of lights and music, the sounds of laughter mingling with the creak of carnival rides. It was a warm evening in late summer, the kind that makes you feel alive. My best friend and I had come to eat cotton candy, play games, and ride the Ferris wheel. We were there to have fun. Nothing more. We wandered through the fair, stopping at booths and laughing as I tried to win a stuffed animal from a claw machine. We moved from ride to ride, each one a mix of joy and adrenaline. As the night grew older, the crowds began to thin, the lights reflecting in puddles left by the day's rain. That's when we saw a sign for an attraction we hadn't noticed before. A large tent with wonders of the unseen written across the entrance in faded, curving letters. I nudged my friend and said, "Why not? We haven't tried anything like this yet." He hesitated but agreed, and we stepped into the tent. The air was cool, the scent of damp canvas mixed with something metallic. Inside, a dimly lit space stretched before us, with rows of oddities on pedestals and glass cases. There were strange sculptures, eyes that seemed to watch you, and jars containing things that looked too grotesque to name. We wandered further, entranced by the bizarre display, until I noticed a small, unmarked glass case in the corner. Inside was a piece of paper, old and yellowed, with a single line scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. "Never turn your back on the silent one." A chill ran through me, and I glanced at my friend. He was staring at the case with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Before I could reply, a sound came from the back of the tent. It was a soft thud, followed by a scraping noise that seemed to draw closer. I turned quickly, heart hammering, and saw nothing but shadows. I felt the weight of those unseen eyes, as if the entire tent had shifted, as if it were holding its breath. A sudden scream pierced the silence, coming from somewhere in the dark. My friend's hand gripped mine so hard that it hurt, but I didn't dare look away from the shifting shadows. The scraping sound was louder now, followed by a soft, guttural whisper. "Go, now!" The voice came from behind us. I spun around, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a figure in tattered clothes, its face obscured by a hood. The eyes that peered out from under the fabric were black and deep, a void that seemed to pull at my mind. The whisper came again. "Leave this place. Leave now." I yanked my friend toward the exit, but the tent seemed to stretch, the entrance impossibly far away. We stumbled over discarded objects and felt the air grow colder. The sound of footsteps behind us quickened, a wet, dragging shuffle. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it getting closer, an unnatural presence that made my skin crawl. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, we burst through the entrance and into the moonlit fairgrounds. The lights seemed brighter, the noise of the music and laughter louder, as if we had just woken up from a nightmare. We ran to the nearest food stand, gasping for breath, eyes darting back to the entrance of the tent. It was empty. The sign for Wonders of the Unseen now looked torn and tattered, barely hanging on its posts. The tent had vanished, leaving only a dark patch of ground where it once stood. We didn't speak about what had happened that night. It was easier not to, but every now and then, when I hear a sound in the dark or feel something move just out of sight, I remember the whisper, the eyes, and the figure that stood in the shadows. Never turn your back on the silent one, and I know it's still out there. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. My brother and I decided to spend the day exploring the old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. We'd heard rumors about it being haunted, but that was just the stuff kids said to scare each other. To us, it was a chance to be reckless, to let loose, to do something different. The air was damp with the scent of rain and rust as we pushed open the broken iron gate. The first thing that hit me was the silence. Not the quiet you'd expect in a place like this, but a deep, suffocating silence that felt almost alive. The park was covered in ivy, the rides towering over us like skeletal remains. I glanced at my brother, and he gave a crooked smile, eyes full of mischief. We started with the Ferris wheel. It was massive, its cabins rested and swaying slightly in the breeze. creaking in a way that made my skin crawl. We climbed up to the top, where the view stretched for miles, and for a moment, I felt invincible, but then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping. I glanced down to see if my brother was moving, but he was still staring at the view. The sound came from below us, deep and guttural, almost like someone pounding on the metal support beams. I stiffened, but before I could say anything, it stopped as suddenly as it started. I told myself it was just the wind, but a part of me wasn't convinced. We moved on to the bumper cars next, their faded paint and cracked plastic faces making them look more like grotesque masks than anything fun. I reached out to touch one, and a sharp noise rang out from the darkness, like a metallic screech that made my teeth chatter. My brother froze, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before I could respond, a cold breeze swept through the pavilion, carrying with it a metallic scent that made me gag. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I spun around, trying to find the source, but the pavilion was empty. Just old, rusted cars that looked like they had been left mid-battle. We were about to leave when I noticed something strange in the ticket booth. A shadow moved inside, and I couldn't tell if it was my imagination. I was just about to call out to my brother when a man stepped out. He was hunched over, his clothes tattered and stained. His eyes were wide, black holes that seemed to pierce through me. He opened his mouth, and a dry, rasping voice whispered, "Don't go to the lake." The air went still, and the silence that followed was deafening. My brother's face turned pale, and I grabbed his arm. The man stepped back into the ticket booth, disappearing as if he'd never been there at all. We didn't speak as we ran to the edge of the park, the sound of our footsteps thundering on the cracked pavement. I glanced back once, and in that brief moment, I saw movement, a dozen figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching us with eyes that glowed like embers. We didn't stop running until we reached the road, breathless and shaking. The park looked the same as when we first entered, but the air felt different now, heavier and colder. The next day, I learned that years before, a family had vanished at the lake that bordered the park. No bodies were ever found. Some said they were taken, others whispered that the lake itself had a hunger for those who dared to come too close. I don't go near the park anymore, but sometimes at night, I can still hear that thumping, that same rhythmic pounding, like someone is trying to claw their way out. And I know, deep down, that whatever is there has seen me, and it's waiting for me to come back. It was just a casual evening stroll through the old part of town. My friend Dan and I were looking for something to do on a Sunday night, so we wandered into the district filled with century-old buildings, antique shops, and strange little cafes that seemed to appear and disappear overnight. The air was crisp, the kind that nipped at your skin, but not enough to make us turn back. We were in the mood for adventure. We found ourselves in front of an old bookstore, its sign creaking as the wind passed through it. The light in the window flickered, casting long, twitching shadows on the cracked pavement. Dan, who loved anything unusual, pushed the door open. A tiny bell chimed, and the musty scent of old paper and leather filled the air. We stepped inside, the creaky floorboards groaning under our weight. An elderly man stood behind the counter, eyes like sunken marbles fixed on us. He didn't speak, only nodded as if he'd been expecting us. Books lined every inch of the walls, the stacks of them towering over us. I turned to Dan, an amused grin playing on my lips. "Find anything interesting?" I joked. Dan smiled back, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite read. He pointed to a dark corner of the shop where a single book sat on a pedestal. The light from the overhead lamp shone on it like it was special. I walked over and felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. The book was bound in cracked black leather with strange, twisted symbols carved into its surface. When I ran my fingers over the cover, a jolt of cold spread up my arm, but I pulled my hand away before I could react. "Don't touch that," the old man said, his voice raspy but urgent. We both looked at him, and I noticed for the first time the way his hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the counter. "Why?" Dan asked, voice curious, defiant even. "It's cursed," the old man said. His eyes darted nervously, but his lips twitched into a thin, knowing smile. "You shouldn't be here. Leave while you still can." I turned to Dan, who was now staring intently at the book. His expression shifted from amusement to a strange kind of determination. He reached out and pulled the book off the pedestal, its weight heavy and unnatural in his hands. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and the shadows seemed to stretch out like fingers across the room. The elderly man's eyes widened, and he made a noise like a choked cry. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a deep, bone-rattling thud from somewhere in the back of the shop. Dan and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us dared to move, but the thud came again, louder, closer. Then came the whisper. It was low and guttural, like someone dragging their nails over a chalkboard. The old man's face turned ashen as he whispered, "Run." Before I could move, a figure stepped into view from behind the bookshelf, a man, or what used to be one, with hollow eyes and a grin that stretched impossibly wide. His limbs bent in ways that weren't natural, joints creaking with each step he took. Don dropped the book, stumbling backward as the figure moved toward us, fingers twitching. The air grew colder, and a sickly smell filled the room, something like decay and rot. We bolted for the door, but the whispering followed us, growing louder, more urgent. It was as if a chorus of voices was coming from every corner, murmuring and pleading. We burst outside, the door slamming behind us, and we didn't stop running until we were back in the main street, gasping for breath. The night had taken on a strange, unnatural stillness, and I could have sworn I saw the old man watching us from the window, the book clutched in his hands, eyes wide and terrified. It was only after we caught our breath that I dared to look back. The bookstore was gone, replaced by a crumbling stone wall, covered in ivy. There was no sign it had ever been there. Dawn and I never spoke about what happened that night. We left town the next morning and never returned. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind howls just right, I hear the faint, echoing whisper that still sends chills down my spine. Run. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and violet as we made our way down the narrow path that led to the old lighthouse. It had been a spontaneous decision, one that seemed adventurous at the time. 3 friends, a quiet evening, and the promise of a breathtaking view. But that promise quickly faded as we approached the towering, weather-beaten structure. The lighthouse had been out of service for years, and rumors swirled that it was haunted. I dismissed them all. Ghosts were for people who wanted to believe in something more. But now, as the wind carried the scent of the sea and the grass around the path swayed, I wasn't so sure. The closer we got, the colder it felt, even though summer had just begun. "Are you sure about this?" Hannah asked, her voice wavering. She was always the cautious one in the group. "Relax, Hannah," Paul said, shoving his hands in his pockets. "We're just going to check it out." The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing a set of steep, narrow stairs spiraling upward. Each step was worn smooth, and the walls smelled of salt and age. We took turns going up, the air growing colder with each step, the only sound our footsteps and the occasional gust of wind slipping through the cracks in the old building. I was the last to climb to the top, catching my breath and feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle. The moon had fully risen now, bathing the world in silver light, and the view from the top was breathtaking. The sea stretched out in every direction, its waves glistening under the moon's pale glow. "This is incredible," Hannah whispered, eyes wide as she gazed out. "Look at that," Paul pointed, his voice barely audible over the wind. I followed his gaze and noticed something strange. A shadow moving just below the waterline, far out where the waves crashed against the rocks. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It looked almost human, but distorted, jerking and twisting in the water like it was in pain. "Guys, you see that, right?" I said, my voice shaking. But neither Hannah nor Paul answered. I glanced back and froze. They were staring at me, eyes wide and unblinking, but their expressions were twisted, almost as if they were in pain. "Paul. Hannah. What's wrong?" I asked, taking a step forward. Their mouths opened, but it wasn't their voices that came out. It was a low, gurgling sound, a mix of laughter and something that sounded like 100 voices speaking at once. I stumbled backward, feeling a sudden cold grip my chest. The air around me seemed to twist and warp, the familiar sea scent now sharp and metallic. Before I could react, the shadow below surged upward, a dark, formless mass with eyes that were a perfect, unnatural shade of black and filled with something that made me freeze in terror. The wind screamed louder, almost drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. Paul and Hannah's faces contorted, their eyes still locked on me, but now I saw what was happening. Their bodies twitched and shuddered, limbs moving like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. Then I understood. Whatever was in the water was trying to pull them in, trying to make them part of itself. "Help us," Paul mouthed, and for a moment, I thought I saw my best friend in there, struggling, trying to break free. But the shadow was too strong. I turned and ran down the stairs, 2 steps at a time. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in. The wind followed me, whispering unintelligible words that made my skin crawl. I made it out of the lighthouse and stumbled into the grass, gasping for air as I looked back. The silhouette of Paul and Hannah was still at the top, staring out at me with eyes as black as the sea. I kept running, all the way to the road, where headlights shone in the distance. I flagged down a car, my voice hoarse as I told the driver to take me away from here. I didn't look back until the lighthouse was a small dot in the rearview mirror, but when I did, I swear I saw those same black eyes staring at me from the top of the tower, watching, waiting. They were still there, and I knew I had to go back, because whatever had taken them had already set its eyes on me. The night my world change started like any other. My friends and I had decided to take an evening trip to the old observatory on the hill. It had been closed for years, abandoned. The last astronomer mysteriously vanished. Rumor had it the place was haunted, but we were young and reckless, ready for any thrill. We didn't believe the stories. The climb up the hill was steep and damp from an earlier rain, the air thick with the scent of moss and pine. The observatory loomed above us, its weathered stone walls cracked with age and covered in ivy that reached out like fingers. The sky was clear, a tapestry of stars, and the moon cast a ghostly glow over everything. Inside, the observatory was dark and silent. The main dome creaked under the weight of time, the giant telescope pointing skyward like a skeletal finger. We wandered through, laughing and daring each other to explore deeper into the building. It wasn't until we reached the old basement that things started to feel wrong. The temperature dropped, and a metallic scent filled the air. We exchanged uneasy glances, but curiosity pushed us forward. The basement was full of old equipment, charts, and abandoned papers scattered like leaves. At the far end was a door, half open, with the faint light seeping through the cracks. Before anyone could stop me, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, cluttered with old photographs and a large, moth-eaten chair. But the strangest part was the mirror. It was an antique, with a frame carved from dark wood and intricate patterns that seemed to twist if you looked at them too long. I stepped closer, feeling a chill creep over my skin. "Hey, come on," Emily called from behind. "Let's get out of here." I nodded, but as I moved, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Only, it wasn't my reflection. The face staring back at me was pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and dark. It grinned, but it was not my smile. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. "There's something in the mirror," I whispered. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the air felt thick, as if something were pressing against my chest. A sound, like the faintest whisper, moved through the room. My friends crowded around, confusion and fear etched on their faces. "What is it?" Marcus asked, stepping forward. Before I could answer, the reflection in the mirror changed. It was no longer just a face, it was an entire scene, a vivid replay of a moment I didn't recognize. A man, hunched over and gasping, in the very room we stood in. His reflection stared at me, eyes wide with terror, as if he knew I was watching him. Then, without warning, his hand reached out, fingers splayed, as though trying to pull me in, get away from it. Emily screamed. I wanted to move, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room shuddered, the floor creaking as though it were about to split open. A cold wind surged past me, carrying with it a voice that echoed in my mind. "Help me." I snapped back to reality, stumbling away from the mirror as it cracked, the glass shattering in a spray of sharp, jagged pieces. The chill lifted, and the room returned to its stillness. My friends were staring at me, fear radiating off them like heat. "What did you see?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. I looked around, not sure how to answer. The air felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the mirror was still there, waiting for me to return. We left the basement without speaking, the silence heavy between us. When we finally stepped out into the open night, the stars above felt colder, the moon more watchful. I never went back to that observatory, none of us did. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch my reflection in a dark window and see a pale, hollow-eyed face grinning at me from the glass dot. It's not just a reflection, it's waiting. The first time I noticed something was off was when I walked into the old public library. It was the middle of the day, yet the atmosphere was heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of dust and decay, with a hint of something sweet that I couldn't quite place. I usually loved the library, the hush of turning pages, the creak of wooden floors, the musty scent of old books, but that day felt different. I wasn't alone. A few people sat scattered among the aisles, some flipping through books and others simply staring blankly at the walls. I wandered past the rows of bookshelves, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as if in sync with my growing unease. As I passed a section of history books, I heard a faint whisper. My pulse quickened, but when I turned, there was no one around. I let out a nervous chuckle and shook my head. I had been up all night studying. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. I moved deeper into the library, drawn to the old, oversized books in the corner. As I reached for one, a chill ran down my spine. The book was open, resting on a table, pages yellowed and stained. But it was the words that caught my attention. "Don't look behind you," I scoffed, dismissing it as some sick joke. But as I glanced over my shoulder, the whispering started again. This time, I heard it clearer, as though it was spoken directly into my ear. "Don't look behind you." I spun around, heart pounding, and locked eyes with an elderly man sitting across the room. He was hunched over, his gnarled fingers playing with the edge of a book, eyes glistening with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just the look in his eyes, it was the way he seemed to lean forward, as if trying to warn me. But his lips never moved. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the air, a rustling like pages being turned. I whipped around to see that all the books around me had fallen open, their pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze that I couldn't feel. A cold draft swept through the aisle, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something metallic. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. The man's voice came again, clearer this time, though still soft and broken. "You shouldn't be here." The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off, plunging the room into a silence so deep it felt suffocating. I stood in the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just a power outage. My breathing echoed off the high ceilings as I reached for my phone, only to find the screen was dead. A soft, steady tapping began behind me, a rhythmic sound like fingernails on wood. I turned, and in the darkness, a thin, shadowy figure stood at the end of the aisle, just at the edge of the light from the window. Its eyes were wide and hollow, and a grin stretched across its face, too wide to be human. Panic surged through me, and I bolted toward the exit, stumbling through the rows of books as they fell around me. I could hear the whispering behind me, growing louder, weaving through the air like a song I couldn't recognize. I dared a glance over my shoulder and saw the figure moving toward me, feet gliding silently over the floor. I didn't stop running until I was out on the street, gasping for air as the sound of whispering finally faded. I dared to look back once, but the library was dark, as if nothing had happened at all. I swore I could still hear the faintest voice saying, "You should have listened," to this day. I never go near that library again, and when I pass it, I can still hear the soft, whispering voice calling out from inside, warning me of the one thing I wish I'd known. Once you hear the library's secrets, you can never leave. It was just another weekend trip. One of those spontaneous plans made when life started to feel suffocating. My friends and I decided to head out to a small, abandoned amusement park that had been closed for decades. It was the kind of place that was spoken about in hushed tones, a rumor passed around at bars and campfires. But none of us truly believed it was haunted. We were there for the thrill of the unknown, to see if we could convince ourselves the old legends were true. We arrived just before sunset, the fading orange light casting long, twisted shadows over rusting rides and crumbling ticket booths. The entrance, a once vibrant arch with peeling paint, seemed to grin at us, daring us to step inside. With flashlights and a mixture of nervous excitement, we ventured in, The park was a maze of broken attractions, half missing clown faces on the Ferris wheel, an old carousel where the horses were now chipped and mottled with dirt. Everything was still, the air heavy with dust and the scent of decaying metal. The silence was so complete it felt like we were intruding on something sacred, something that shouldn't be disturbed. We explored for hours, jumping at every creak and groan as the wind swept through the twisted metal. By the time the last light dipped below the horizon, we were ready to head back. But as we walked toward the entrance, a loud, shrill laughter echoed from the direction of the FUNHOUSE. We all froze. The laughter was high-pitched and childlike, like it was coming from deep within the warped hallways of the broken building. My friend Mark snorted, trying to laugh it off. "Probably just the wind," he said, though there was a tremor in his voice. "Let's check it out," Lizzie whispered, her eyes wide in the beam of her flashlight. None of us said no. Our curiosity got the better of us. The fun house was even worse up close. Its walls were warped, the windows shattered with jagged edges that looked like broken teeth. We pushed open the door, its rusty hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was colder than outside, the scent of dampness and mold clinging to our noses. The floorboards creaked beneath our weight, and the walls seemed to lean in, closing us off from the rest of the world. We moved through the maze, the laughter growing louder, echoing from somewhere deeper within. We finally reached the center, where an old mirror maze stretched out in front of us, cracked and splintered like spiderwebs. In the dim light, we could see each other's reflections in a million broken pieces. The laughter stopped suddenly, and we all tensed, looking around. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice barely louder than a whisper. A shadow moved in one of the mirrors. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. But now, I noticed that one of the mirrors wasn't cracked, it was smooth, polished like a new surface. As I stepped closer, the cold feeling of dread spread through my chest. The mirror reflected my own face. But behind me, in the reflection, a dark figure stood just out of sight. My pulse quickened, my mouth going dry. The figure stepped forward, slowly, impossibly, and I stumbled back. Lizzie screamed, and Mark yelled, "Run!" But the entrance we had come through was gone. The walls of the fun house seemed to have shifted, trapping us inside. The figure in the mirror moved, its shadowy limbs stretching out like they were reaching for me. I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating, seeping into my bones. The mirror cracked, then shattered, and the laughter returned, louder, closer, as if dozens of people were in the maze with us. We bolted, not looking back, running through the maze of cracked glass and warped hallways until we stumbled outside. The night air was sharp with the scent of rust and cold, and the laughter still echoed in our ears. We didn't stop running until we were out of the park, looking back to see the lights of the funhouse flickering and going out, one by one. None of us spoke on the ride home. We didn't need to. We all knew that whatever we had seen was waiting for us in that mirror, something that wasn't just part of the broken funhouse, but something that had been trapped, lurking for years, waiting for someone to set it free. The late summer night was sticky with heat as I walked home from the corner store, a bottle of cheap soda in one hand and the other swinging at my side. It was just past 11 p.m., and the neighborhood was quieter than usual. The street lamps flickered like they were struggling to stay alive, casting pools of yellow light that barely reached the sidewalk. I had always loved this part of town. Old, sprawling trees lined the streets, their thick, gnarled branches creating a canopy of darkness. But tonight, that darkness felt alive, as if it had eyes that watched and waited. I turned down my street, the houses shadowy sentinels with shutters like watchful eyes. It was then that I heard a soft, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the direction of the old school building at the end of the block. The building had been closed for years, ever since the fire that charred its wooden walls and left the whole place an empty shell. They said it was haunted, though I dismissed those stories as kids' tales. But that thumping sound made me stop. It was a dull thud, like someone was tapping a wooden stick against the wall. I glanced at the school, its silhouette dark against the inky sky, and felt a chill crawl up my spine. My feet moved before I could think, carrying me across the street and toward the broken iron gate that led into the schoolyard. The thumping grew louder as I stepped inside. It echoed against the cracked concrete, a steady beat that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I walked slowly, eyes darting to the windows that had long since been boarded up, every creak of the old boards under my feet sounding like a shout in the silence. As I reached the building's front steps, I noticed the air had shifted. It felt colder, like a breath of winter had blown through the cracked bricks. I hesitated. My breath caught in my throat, but then the thumping stopped, dead silence. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back. Then I heard a faint voice, whispering, and though it was soft, it cut through the stillness like a blade. Leave. I froze, eyes wide as I searched the shadows for movement. But the yard was empty. No hint of life. No sign of who or what had spoken. The voice was so close, yet there was no one there. A sudden, sharp crack split the air, and I spun around to see one of the wooden boards on a window shutter as if hit from the inside. The voice came again, now louder, clearer. Leave now. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a loose piece of brick. The whispering was joined by the sound of feet, dragging in the dirt behind me. They moved slow, heavy, and the scrape of fabric on concrete made my skin prickle. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing, no figure, no silhouette. I needed to get out of there, but my legs felt like lead. I turned and ran, sprinting down the street as fast as I could. The thumping resumed, pounding behind me like a drumbeat, growing louder and closer with every step. I dared not look back. I didn't stop until I was safely back on my porch, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. The street was empty, the houses dark, but I could still hear the faint thumping, now muffled, like it was coming from somewhere deep in the distance. I was about to breathe a sigh of relief when the whisper came again, this time from inside my own house. Leave. I spun around, the bottle of soda slipping from my fingers and shattering on the floor. There, in the hallway, a shadow stood, taller than any man I'd ever seen, but with limbs that moved like they were made of thin, broken twigs. It tilted its head, and its eyes to deep, hollow pits locked with mine. The thumping started again, echoing from the empty rooms of the house. It was never the school. It had been following me all along. I had never been one for city life. So, when my friends invited me on a spontaneous day trip to the countryside, I jumped at the chance. We packed a picnic, hopped in a car, and drove for hours, leaving the noise and pollution behind for rolling fields and the fresh scent of wildflowers. The air was different out there, light and cool, and it made me feel freer than I had in years. The fields seemed endless, a patchwork of greens and yellows, with a lonely barn standing at the edge, worn down and forgotten. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in an old photograph, the kind where the grass has a slightly wild look, like it's been waiting for a long time to be noticed. We parked by the barn, unloaded our food, and set out to explore. I was the first to find the small, withered path that led to a cluster of trees at the edge of a clearing. I followed it with my friends, and soon we found ourselves standing in front of a pond, the water as still as glass, reflecting the sky like a giant mirror. We spent hours there, laughing and taking turns skipping rocks, the sun sinking lower in the sky as we began to feel the cool of evening. That was when I noticed something odd, a small shack, half hidden by overgrown ivy, in the distance across the pond. None of us had seen it before. "What's that?" I asked, pointing. My friend Anna squinted, her brow furrowed. I don't think it was there before. It was true. I felt like I would have noticed a building like that, something that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. We debated whether to check it out, the setting sun casting long, wavering shadows across the grass, but curiosity won out. We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the shack, each step making the forest feel denser, the air colder. The shack was in worse shape than I expected. The roof had holes where rain had leaked through, and one of the wooden slats was missing from the wall, revealing a dark interior. A foul smell came from inside, like rotting meat, and I felt my stomach twist. "Hey, maybe we shouldn't go in," Mark said, his voice faltering. He looked pale, his hands trembling. "It's probably just old junk," Anna said, trying to sound brave. I nodded, but my throat was dry. I took a breath and pushed the door open, the hinges squealing in protest. The room was dark except for the thin beams of light from our flashlights. Dust settled on everything, from the tattered curtains to the broken chairs. But what made me freeze was the wooden figure in the corner. It was a crude carving of a person, hunched over, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grimace. Its limbs were shaped like twisted branches, and there were strange carvings all over its body, symbols I couldn't read, but that made my skin crawl when I looked at them. I tried to move, but the door slammed shut behind us, so hard that it cracked the frame. We all jumped, exchanging terrified glances. I reached for the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. The air grew heavier, as if someone or something was pressing against us from the outside. Anna gasped, pointing at the figure. The eyes, which had seemed so hollow before, now looked like they were watching us. The carved mouth opened, letting out a sound that was half a scream, half a groan. We all screamed and scrambled for the door, but when we turned back, the figure was moving, stepping toward us with an unnatural, jerky motion. It stopped when it reached the threshold, tilting its head like a curious animal. My heart pounded as we burst through the door, the night air outside feeling colder than before. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, our lungs burning and our legs aching. As we drove away, the last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the shack, and standing in its doorway was the figure, watching us with those hollow eyes that never blinked. I never went back to the countryside. None of us did, and even now, years later, I never forget that face or the feeling of being watched, as though something unseen still follows me, waiting for the day when I'll go back and see it again. The sun had just set as I drove down the narrow, winding road that led to my grandmother's house. I had come to visit her for the weekend, a rare trip to reconnect after years of living in the city. The countryside was always eerie at twilight, with fields that stretched out like dark, restless oceans, and rows of trees that seemed to watch me as I passed. My grandmother's house stood at the edge of a small, overgrown field, surrounded by clusters of wildflowers that seemed to move in the wind like they were whispering secrets. The air was still and heavy, tinged with the scent of damp earth. As I pulled up, the porch light flickered, casting shadows that rippled across the wooden planks. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding louder than it should have in the silence. The house seemed to sigh, its old wood creaking in protest as if it had been holding its breath. I knocked on the front door, and at the moment, my grandmother appeared in the doorway, a smile softening the deep lines of her face. "Oh, you made it," she said. Her voice was weak but warm, and she pulled me into a tight embrace. The first night was simple enough. We sat in the kitchen, ate homemade pie, and listened to the quiet hum of the night outside. The only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. But, as the clock struck midnight, I heard something that made me pause mid-bite. A faint tapping noise came from the direction of the back door. I glanced at my grandmother, who looked suddenly tense, her eyes darting to the hallway that led to the back of the house. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, but her lips were pressed into a thin line. "It's probably just the wind," she said, though I could hear the tremor in her voice. I stood up and moved cautiously to the back door. The tapping was louder now, but there was no wind, no reason for it. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the latch and pulled the door open. Darkness met me, nothing but the field and the forest beyond. But then I saw a figure, cloaked in shadow, standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was too far away to make out any features, but it stood motionless, as if waiting. "Grandma, someone's out there," I called, turning back to look at her. Before she could answer, the figure moved forward, stepping out of the shadows. It was not human, not entirely. Its limbs were unnaturally long, joints bending in ways they shouldn't, and its eyes reflected the light from the porch in a sharp, unnatural gleam. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my hands trembling. "We need to call the police." My grandmother's eyes were wide, tears welling up as she reached for my arm. "It's too late," she whispered. "It's already here." The tapping resumed, but now it was all around the house. The walls groaned as though something heavy was pressing against them. A sudden crash sounded from the kitchen, and I spun around to see the figure, impossibly thin and contorted, standing on the other side of the glass window. Its mouth opened wide, a black void lined with teeth that seemed to stretch forever. I grabbed my grandmother's hand, dragging her toward the front door. We stumbled over furniture and ducked past shattered picture frames as the pounding grew louder, more insistent. But before we could make it out, The front door flew open, the hinges splintering as the wind howled through the room. There, framed by the moonlight, was the figure, now more solid, more real than I could have imagined. It stared at us, a twisted, unholy grin stretching across its face. And then I realized the truth. It wasn't here to take us, not tonight. It had come for something else. And behind us, I heard my grandmother's voice, distant and hollow, whispering, "It's here for me." A scream tore through the night as the figure lunged forward. But before it could reach us, it stopped, a ragged shudder passing through its body. Then it crumbled to the floor, melting into a puddle of shadow and wet earth. I blinked, disoriented, and looked at my grandmother. Her eyes were closed, a peaceful smile on her face. The tapping had stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was different, oppressive, and final. When I stepped outside, the figure was gone, but I noticed something. In the field behind the house, the ground was cracked, and the soil was dark, almost black, as though it had been scorched. And in the moonlight, I swore I could see shapes forming, figures reaching up from the earth, waiting for the next visitor. I drove back to the city that night, heart heavy and mind reeling. The countryside was quiet again, but I knew better now. Some things are never truly gone. Some things are just waiting. The park was beautiful that evening, with tall oaks and maple trees casting long, dappled shadows across the worn walking paths. It was a popular spot, nestled between the city and a sprawling riverbank, filled with joggers, families, and old couples who liked to feed the pigeons. I had been there countless times, but that day felt different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and a strange, damp smell clung to the breeze. I was walking alone, headphones in, trying to shake off a bad mood that had settled over me all day. The path twisted through dense thickets, and the chatter of nearby park-goers faded into the background. It was growing darker, and a chill seeped into my bones. I checked my watch just past 7 p.m. The sun had dipped behind the trees, painting the sky a bruised purple. I should have turned back, but I didn't want to go home, unless yet. Then I heard a soft whisper that seemed to brush against my ear. I yanked out my headphones and looked around. The park was still, empty save for a pair of joggers far off in the distance and the occasional flutter of wings from the trees. I told myself it was just the wind and kept walking, but the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. It was a voice, almost melodic, saying one word over and over, "Come." It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I stopped, scanning the path behind me, but there was no one. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and took a shaky breath before continuing forward. The path narrowed and curved into a part of the park that I had never explored before. It was eerily quiet. No sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, just that insistent voice, drawing me in. My heart pounded, but curiosity won out. I stepped off the path and into the underbrush, where brambles clawed at my jeans. The whisper led me deeper, away from the familiar trails. A clearing appeared, shrouded in shadows and framed by old stone statues of animals cracked and overrun with ivy. In the center stood an old fountain, water dry and choked with moss. But the most unsettling part was the girl. She was sitting on the edge of the fountain, her legs folded and her head bowed, as if lost in thought. Her hair was dark and unkempt, tangled with leaves and twigs. "Hey," I called hesitantly, my voice cracking in the silence. The girl didn't move, but I felt her gaze on me, even before she lifted her head. Her eyes were wide and vacant, too large for her face, rimmed with dark circles. And then she spoke, her voice so cold it made my blood freeze. "Not safe here," she whispered, but her lips didn't move. Before I could react, I heard the crunch of twigs behind me. Spinning around, I saw a figure emerge from the trees, a tall shadow with long, spindly limbs. The silhouette stepped forward, and the light of the moon caught its twisted smile. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in the light. The girl stood up, her movements jerky, as if she were a marionette controlled by unseen strings. She looked at me, and in that instant, I knew she wasn't just warning me. She was trying to protect me. "Run," she mouthed, and the shadow lunged. I didn't think, I just ran. Branches whipped at my face, and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop until I broke through the trees and stumbled onto the main path. I gasped for air, Looking back, the shadow had stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching me, but it didn't follow. The girl's silhouette stood behind it, her head cocked to one side as if waiting. The park lights flickered back to life, and the world around me settled into the comforting hum of the city. I turned and ran in the direction of the nearest street, every step echoing with the rush of my heart. When I finally reached the street, the voice whispered one last time, "Safe, but only for now." I didn't go back to that park, not ever. And now, every time I hear that whisper, a shiver runs through me. I still don't know what I saw that night, but I know one thing for certain. There's something in that park that follows those who listen to the whispers. I've never been a superstitious person. Growing up, my friends would make fun of me for not believing in ghost stories, haunted houses, or any of that paranormal nonsense. But that summer, on the farm with my cousin and her family, everything changed. The farm was far away from the city, surrounded by miles of golden fields that swayed in the wind like an ocean of grain. The air was warm and smelled of freshly tilled soil and wild flowers. I thought it would be a perfect escape from the noise and chaos of my life. The first couple of days were idyllic: morning chores, afternoons playing in the fields, and long evenings sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. It felt like the kind of summer I'd imagined when I was a kid. Then, one evening, things took a turn. We were sitting on the back porch, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples as the sun set behind the hills. My cousin, Maria, mentioned offhand that the old barn had been abandoned for years, ever since her great-grandfather had disappeared. I asked her what she meant, and she shrugged, a look of unease passing over her face. "People say he went into the barn one night and never came out. Some say he's still there, waiting." I laughed, but it felt hollow. That night, after Maria and her family went to bed, I found myself staring out the window at the barn. It loomed in the distance, an ancient silhouette against the moonlit sky, its broken windows like hollow eyes. I don't know why I did it, but I found myself grabbing a flashlight and walking out into the dark. The fields seemed alive as the wind rushed past, the stalks whispering secrets that only they could understand. I crossed the yard, the wooden boards creaking under my feet as I approached the barn. The air grew colder, making my breath visible in short puffs. I hesitated at the door, fingers on the rusted latch. The barn had always seemed solid in the daylight, but now it looked like it might collapse at any second. I pushed the door open, and it groaned in protest, revealing a pitch-black interior. The flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting eerie shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. I shone the beam around, but the space was empty, save for broken tools and a dusty old cart. It was only when I turned my head that I saw it, the faint outline of a figure. Standing in the corner, my heart clenched, and I backed up, tripping over a rotting board. The flashlight fell from my hand, and for a second, the barn was swallowed by darkness. I reached out blindly, fumbling for it. Just as my fingers closed around the cold metal, a voice whispered from the dark, "Leave." The hair on my arms stood on end, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. My pulse roared in my ears as I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door. Just before I could leave, I felt something cold brush past my neck, like a shadow moving against my skin. I glanced back one last time, and for a split second, I saw a face pale and gaunt, with eyes that glimmered like shards of glass. I didn't stop running until I was safe inside the house, the front door locked behind me. I barely slept that night, the sound of my ragged breaths mingling with the distant creak of the barn door swinging in the wind. The next morning, Maria found me pale and jittery at the breakfast table. I told her I'd just been out for a walk, but she looked at me with knowing eyes. After breakfast, she led me to the old barn, the morning sun casting long shadows across the fields. "Whatever you saw, it was real," she whispered. "But you should know it's not just the barn that holds them. They watch from the fields too." I turned, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw dozens of figures watching me from the wheat, their faces pale and empty, eyes hollow with the same endless hunger. I never went back to the farm, and I never looked at an open field the same way again. I was never a fan of the old, abandoned amusement park on the edge of town. It was more of an eyesore than anything, a relic from a better time, rusted and decaying. But on that day, with the sun low and the air heavy with the smell of rain. My friends convinced me to go. We wanted something different for once, and what better way to kick off the summer than exploring somewhere creepy? We made our way through the overgrown paths and cracked pavement, the chirping of cicadas growing louder as the sky darkened. The entrance was flanked by two massive stone lions with chipped noses and vacant eyes. We pushed open the wrought iron gate, the hinges protesting with a screech that echoed in the silence. The place was a maze of forgotten rides. The Ferris wheel loomed over us like a skeletal giant, its seat swaying in the breeze. A bumper car track sat to the left, rusted vehicles tilted at odd angles. We wandered further in, laughing and daring each other to go deeper. It was around the fun house when I noticed the first strange thing. A soft, metallic thud came from behind us, like someone had dropped a heavy tool. We all turned, but the path was empty, probably just a raccoon, Lisa said, brushing her hair behind her ear. But I felt it then, a presence, a tingle that ran from the back of my neck to my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. I glanced at my friends, but they were too busy poking fun at each other to notice. We pressed on, past a derelict clown stage where torn posters flapped like restless ghosts. The wind picked up, swirling around us and making the plastic banners snap like whips. Then, without warning, we heard a low, groaning hum that seemed to come from deep within the ground. "What was that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath us shuddered. I stumbled, grabbing for the nearest rail. The whole park seemed to shift, as if a giant had taken a deep breath. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went still. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice more urgent than I intended. But they didn't hear me. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the Ferris wheel. I turned to see what they were looking at and my blood froze. The wheel had moved. Just a fraction, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. One of the seats, a rusty bucket on the edge, creaked forward and backward like it was testing the air. And then, a child's giggle rang out. It was high-pitched and sweet, but it wasn't human. My breath caught in my throat as I turned back to my friends. "We need to leave now," I said, grabbing Mark by the arm, but he didn't move. He was staring at the clown stage where a small, shadowy figure stood. It had the shape of a child, but its limbs were too long and bent at unnatural angles. Another giggle, closer this time. I pulled Mark again, but he yanked his arm free and stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror. The figure on the stage came to life. It moved with the jerky, stuttering motion of a marionette, limbs twitching in a dance that felt both mechanical and alive. It was dressed in a faded clown suit, with patches that looked like they had been stitched with coarse, black thread. Its face was painted in a grotesque grin, eyes hollow and unblinking. "Get out," I screamed, grabbing Lisa and dragging her toward the exit. We ran past the bumper cars, the wind roaring behind us as the distant sound of a carnival organ started up, playing a broken, discordant tune. As we reached the gate, the childish giggle cut through the air again, louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder one last time and saw a pale hand, fingers too long and tipped with dark nails, reaching out from the edge of the Ferris wheel seat. The night air felt sharp as we bolted through the gate, the iron bars clanging shut behind us. We didn't stop running until we were far from the park, the sounds of the organ still ringing in our ears. None of us spoke on the way home. When we looked at each other, we knew we had seen a glimpse of something that shouldn't be. A reminder that some places hold more than just memories. They hold echoes of things that should have been forgotten. And the park, with its twisted laughter and stilled rides, was far from abandoned. It was waiting. It was supposed to be an easy night out. A few friends and I had decided to go stargazing. We found a quiet, isolated hilltop that overlooked the city, far away from the bright lights and noise. The evening had been perfect at first, with the sky an endless sea of stars, a cool breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers, and laughter as we set up our blankets and telescoped. As the night deepened, the air became colder, more oppressive. We didn't mind at first. We were too busy taking turns peering through the telescope and making silly jokes. But the deeper we went into the night, the more the landscape around us seemed to change. The trees, which had been a comforting ring of shadows, now felt like they were watching us, their branches moving in strange, unnatural ways. The rustling wasn't the wind, It was as if the forest had a life of its own. I shifted on my blanket and glanced at my phone. It was nearly midnight, and I was starting to feel an inexplicable sense of dread. Just as I opened my mouth to say something, one of my friends, Jenna, screamed. We all turned to see her standing by the edge of the hill, her face pale, eyes wide. "What is it?" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. "There's someone down there," she gasped, pointing into the dark. We all stared in the direction she indicated, but I couldn't see anything, just the inky blackness of the forest below. "Jenna, there's no one there," Matt said, trying to sound reassuring. But there was a tremble in his voice that made my skin crawl. "No, look," she insisted, eyes locked on something in the trees. I squinted, heart thudding in my chest as I tried to see what she saw. It wasn't a person. It was a figure, tall and thin, its limbs too long and bendy, like a scarecrow brought to life. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and even from a distance, I could tell it was staring right at us. "Guys, we need to go. Now," I said, my voice cracking. We gathered our things, but as we started back toward the car, the sound of footsteps came from behind us, uneven and dragging. It felt as though the woods were closing in, surrounding us with the faint, dry rustling of leaves and the thud of heavy feet. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a second figure, this one closer, emerging from the dark. Its eyes were hollow and glowing faintly, an unnatural, sickly yellow. My breath caught in my throat as we broke into a run, the air sharp with panic and the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. "Go, go, go," Matt shouted, pushing past me. We all sprinted for the car, the night echoing with the crunch of footsteps behind us. When we finally reached the vehicle, I fumbled to unlock it. Heart racing as the shadows stretched and shifted around us, we piled into the car, and I slammed the door shut, locking it just as a figure emerged at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with those hollow eyes. It tilted its head slowly, a broken, jerky motion that made my blood run cold. "Drive, drive," Jenna shouted, and Matt didn't hesitate. The tires screeched against the gravel as we peeled away, the headlights slicing through the darkness. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures, their twisted bodies still watching us, still following, until they vanished back into the woods. We didn't stop until we were safely back in town, every one of us shaken to speak. But as I lay in bed that night, trying to find sleep, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing, hollow eyes watching us from the dark. The next day, I went back to the hilltop with a friend, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But when we arrived, I found something that made my stomach twist. At the base of the trees were deep, wide tracks, footprints with long, claw-like toes that seemed to stretch into the woods, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. And in the distance, I swore I heard a voice, ragged and whispering, coming from the dark, saying, "You are not supposed to leave." I had never been a fan of summer fairs. The noise, the crowded booths, the unsettling clamor of carnival music playing out of tune, it all made me uneasy. But when my friend Lucas convinced me to go with him that Friday night, I couldn't say no. It was meant to be a simple escape, just a couple of hours spent in a crowded park with greasy food and cheap rides. It turned out to be anything but. The fairgrounds were a sprawling mess of flashing lights and laughter, the scent of fried dough mingling with the sharp tang of something metallic. Lucas and I wandered from one ride to another. The thrill of seeing the old attractions sparked childhood memories. But then we stumbled across an old fortune teller's tent, an out-of-place relic with a sign that said, "Find out what fate has in store for you." Before I could stop him, Lucas was already tugging me toward the entrance. The air inside was thick with the scent of incense, and dim, flickering candles cast jagged shadows along the walls. An old woman sat at the table, her back hunched and eyes like dark marbles that seemed to follow you wherever you went. "You are here for answers," she rasped, her voice thin and raspy. "But they come at a cost." Lucas glanced at me, a grin tugging at his lips. "We're just here for fun," he said, but I could tell there was something else in his eyes. A challenge, maybe, or a dare. I sat down next to him as the woman shuffled a deck of worn, tattered cards. Her hands, covered in rings that seemed older than the fair itself, moved with a practiced grace. She laid the cards out one by one, whispering in a language I didn't understand. I leaned forward, suddenly aware that we had wandered into something I couldn't control. She stopped on a card, her eyes narrowing. "Your fate is not yet written," she said, "but it will be tonight." Lucas scoffed, but I felt a chill trace the back of my neck. "All right, we're done here," I said, standing up. The woman's eyes locked with mine, and her mouth twitched into a smile. It was not the smile of someone who was joking. "You'll see," she whispered. The rest of the night was normal, or so I thought. We rode the Ferris wheel, ate cotton candy, and laughed as Lucas tried to win a stuffed bear at the ring toss. But then, when we were walking by the carousel, I heard the faint sound of music playing backward, like a record that had been scratched. I glanced at Lucas, who was staring ahead, his expression unreadable. Then the lights flickered. For a moment, the fair seemed to pause, holding its breath. A shiver ran down my spine as the carousel horses began to move on their own, their eyes wide and unnatural. The painted mouths twisted into silent screams. "Lucas," I whispered, but when I turned to look at him, he was gone. I ran through the fair, pushing past laughing families and confused carnival workers, but there was no sign of him. The world around me began to spin, as if I was caught in some kind of fever dream. The air grew colder, and the noise the children's laughter. The distant shout of a carny died down, replaced by a thumping that grew louder, like something heavy dragging itself across the ground. I turned a corner and nearly stumbled into him. Lucas stood by the fortune teller's tent, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes that were not his own. The air around him crackled, a strange blue light radiating from his body. "It's time," he said, voice deep and unrecognizable. I reached out, but before I could touch him, he crumbled into dust, the light vanishing as if it had never been there. I stumbled backward, gasping, only to find myself alone, the carnival now lifeless and gray, the twisted remnants of the tent flapping in the wind. A whisper curled around me, slicing through the silence. "You were warned." I didn't know if I ran or if I was dragged away by the wind, but the next thing I knew, I was standing on the empty road leading back to town, my heart slamming against my ribs. The fair was gone, vanished like it never existed, and Lucas was gone too. All that remained was the taste of metal on my tongue and the memory of the cards. I never went back to the fairgrounds, but I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, telling me that fate can come for you whether you want it to or not. I never thought a simple apartment would be the place where I'd experience something so terrifying. It started out like any other routine, working long hours, barely having enough time to eat, and coming back to my cramped, inexpensive apartment late at night. The building I lived in wasn't great, but it was cheap. And it was close to my job. It was an old place, with narrow hallways and flickering lights that made me feel like I was in a horror movie. Most of the tenants were quiet, reclusive types, people who just wanted to live in peace without much hassle. One evening, I returned from work and noticed something off. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar, not wide open, just a crack, as if someone had left in a hurry or forgotten to fully close it. I don't know why I didn't think twice about it. Maybe I was just exhausted. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt that unease creeping in. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, like it wasn't circulating properly. I closed the door behind me and tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Everything seemed in its place, no signs of a break-in, no obvious disturbances. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until I went to the bathroom that I found it. The mirror. It wasn't cracked, but it was smeared. I could see fingerprints along the edges, almost like someone had pressed their hands against it and slowly moved them around, leaving greasy streaks. I didn't know how I didn't notice it earlier. I had been in the bathroom just that morning. I wiped the mirror clean, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing faint noises, scraping sounds, like nails dragging against the floor. They weren't constant, but every now and then, I'd hear them from somewhere outside my bedroom door. I told myself it was just the building settling, an old structure making strange noises, but then I heard something else. A whisper, just outside my door. It was a voice, soft and almost melodic, but it made my blood run cold. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't my imagination. It was clear, too real to ignore. The whispering continued, a low hum that seemed to get closer with every passing minute. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, wondering if someone had broken in. But, if they had, why didn't they make a sound when they came in? I crept to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I stood still for a moment, waiting for any sound. The whispering stopped, and I thought I'd imagined it. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stepped out into the hallway and looked around. Nothing. It was just the usual dim lighting and the closed doors of other apartments. But the air felt wrong, colder than usual. As I walked back to my apartment, I glanced toward the elevator. It was an old, creaky thing, but it was never in use at night. Except tonight, it was moving, slowly, the lights flickering as it descended. I froze. The elevator doors opened, and no one was inside. I didn't waste another second. I rushed back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I was losing control of everything, my thoughts, my senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me for days. Something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The next morning, I went to the landlord's office to ask about the strange events. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the building for years. She looked at me with a concerned expression when I mentioned hearing noises and seeing the elevator move on its own. "Oh, that happens sometimes," she said, her voice low and almost too calm. "The building has a history." I was about to ask her what she meant when she continued, "People hear things in this place, footsteps, whispers, and sometimes the elevator moves by itself. It's just the old pipes. You know, the building settles." She smiled politely, but there was something off about her tone. "Don't worry, though, it's harmless." I didn't feel reassured. That night, the same strange things happened again. The whispering, the scratching, the elevator. But this time, something changed. The whispering wasn't just a voice, it was my voice. It was me, but not me. A distorted, mocking version of my own voice, saying things I hadn't even thought. Things like, "You're still here and it's only just begun." Panicked, I rushed to the bathroom to see if I was imagining things. But then I saw the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't my reflection. There was a woman standing in my place, her face twisted in an expression I couldn't quite recognize. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and she was smiling. I stumbled back, almost falling over, and as I turned to run, I heard her voice, clear as day, from behind me. "You're not leaving." I've always worked late shifts at the old city library. The building is massive, a maze of bookshelves and reading nooks, half-lit and musty. I loved it. It was quiet, save for the sound of the pages turning and the occasional hiss of the old, creaky radiator. But it wasn't until the winter storm hit that I discovered how easily something could hide within the shadows. That night, I was the only one there. The wind whistled through the cracked panes of glass, and the lights flickered sporadically. I pushed the thought of getting stuck inside the library out of my mind. I had a shift to finish. The snow piled up against the doors like an impenetrable wall, and I couldn't hear the city at all anymore. It felt like the whole world had gone silent. I stood up from the desk and stretched, looking over the vast sea of books. I made my way down the aisle of history, past the stacks of dusty volumes and the occasional antique globe. It was here, in the quiet solitude, that I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. Just rows upon rows of books, their spines blanketed in darkness. I pushed it aside and continued. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I stopped by the reference section, leaning against the oak desk. I swiped my phone out of habit. No signal. Of course. The library was a black hole for reception. The sudden jolt of the lights cutting out made me jump. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold breath at the back of my neck. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I stumbled back, eyes searching for a source of the chill. The emergency lights came on, casting a blood-orange glow that made the old, dusty books appear as if they were bleeding. I shivered and tried to steady my breathing, but something didn't feel right. The silence returned, deeper and more suffocating. I swallowed hard, daring to move toward the staff room to check the circuit box. I was halfway across the room when I heard a sharp, wet slap behind me. I spun around, eyes going wide as they locked onto the source, a book, lying open on the floor, its pages moving as if stirred by some invisible hand. The pages whispered, the sound more like a breathing than a breeze. I crept closer, the soft crackling of the old floorboards beneath my feet. The book was open to a page I didn't recognize, a drawing in the margin of a hollow-eyed face with a grotesque grin. The lines seemed to shift as I stared. The eyes blinked, then looked straight at me. The distant creak of a chair moving in the staff room pulled my attention. I took a shaky breath, clutching the book to my chest, and turned to find the door ajar, a deep, unnatural shadow spilling out into the hallway. The scent of damp earth and something rotting reached me as I inched forward. I didn't remember leaving it open. The room was empty, but I noticed the far window, cracked and icy, was now wide open. The wind howled, pulling the pages of nearby books like they were alive. And then I heard a sound like a quiet giggle, sharp and full of malice. My pulse quickened, my skin crawling. In the dim light, I noticed it, a figure just inside the dark, its head too large for its shoulders, grinning wide, eyes empty but fixed on me. I backed up, the book slipping from my hands as I stumbled over my feet. It hit the floor with a thud that echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. Then it lunged. The next moment was a blur. I was out of the library and into the biting wind, not daring to look back, the giggle still ringing in my ears. The snow was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but I ran, faster than I ever had before. When I finally reached the street, the library's lights were out, completely dark. No more orange glow, no more whispers, just the cold and the oppressive silence. The next day, when I went back to retrieve my things, the library was exactly as I had left it, the book lying open on the floor, the page with the face now blank. They never believed me. The others said I was just tired, imagining things. But every time I passed the library, I glanced at the window where I saw it watching me. And I swear it's still there, waiting. The first time I saw the old man, I thought he was just a local, wandering through the market like everyone else. It was late afternoon, the sun a lazy disk in the sky, painting the city in hues of gold and shadow. I was at the open-air market, the kind with vendors yelling about their wares, hawking everything from fresh fruit to handmade jewelry. I always loved coming here. It was a small escape from the monotony of my life. He was standing by the flower stall, head bent, as if examining the petals. He was tall and thin, with the face creased into a labyrinth of wrinkles, eyes clouded and pale. When I caught him staring, I looked away quickly, my skin crawling. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just an old man, lonely and curious. I didn't see him again until later, that evening when I was walking home, weaving through the narrow, cobbled streets. The sky had darkened, and the street lamps cast long, flickering pools of light across the pavement. As I passed an abandoned building, I heard the sound of shuffling feet behind me. I turned, and there he was, his pale eyes fixed on me, hands shaking at his sides. "Are you following me?" I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. He stopped, tilted his head, and said something so low I couldn't make out the words, but the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine, as if he knew something I didn't. I quickened my pace, heart thundering in my chest. The sound of his footsteps echoed after me until I reached the safety of the busy street where people still lingered, chatting and laughing. I dared a glance over my shoulder, but he had vanished. The next day, I woke up to a strange feeling, the air in my room heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of feeling that makes you check the locks on your doors, make sure every window is secure. I told myself it was just paranoia, but when I pulled open the curtains, my heart almost stopped. There, in the alleyway just across from my apartment, the old man stood. He stared, unmoving, his eyes wide and hollow. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he raised a hand and pointed directly at me. A rush of icy dread shot through me. I slammed the window shut, the thud shaking the walls. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I stayed home, peeking through the blinds, waiting for him to reappear. Hours passed, the light shifting from morning to afternoon, but he didn't come back. Just as I let out a shaky breath, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated, frozen, and then a voice called out, "Hello. Miss, are you okay? It's the building manager. We've had reports of strange activity." I opened the door a crack, heart hammering. He stood there in a neat, gray uniform, eyes kind but curious. I nodded, mutely, and he continued, "We've been getting complaints about someone lurking in the alley. Any idea who it might be?" I tried to speak, but couldn't. Finally, I managed to say, "An old man. He's been watching me." The manager raised an eyebrow. "There's no one out there now, but we've had similar reports for weeks. People say he appears and disappears like a shadow, never coming any closer." My blood ran cold. "Do you know who he is?" The manager shook his head. "He's been around for years. People say he's a ghost, or something worse. But he only appears to those who need to see him. Stay inside tonight, miss." I thanked him, my voice trembling, and shut the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards, had me on edge. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard a faint tapping at the window. Light as a feather, I couldn't help myself. I pulled the curtains aside, and there he was, standing in the dark, one hand pressed to the glass as if trying to push through. Before I could scream, he whispered in a voice barely audible, "You're not safe." The glass fogged up with his breath, and a shape appeared, a face. My own face, but older, withered and cracked, eyes hollow and dark. I stumbled back, gasping. He vanished into the night, leaving only the chill and the echo of those words. It's been years now, and I've never seen him again. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right or when the street lamps flicker in the dark, I swear I feel that cold, hollow stare, waiting, watching, and I know he's still out there, looking for the next one to hear his warning. My friends and I chose a secluded spot deep in the forest, miles away from any trails or campsites. The idea was to get lost in nature and enjoy the quiet. We had no idea how quickly the peace would unravel. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink as we unloaded our gear. The trees here were dense, their trunks thick and dark. The sun barely filtered through the leaves. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and built a fire at the center of our camp. As the evening deepened, the air grew colder, and the fire's crackling was the only sound that broke the silence. At first, the forest seemed comforting, isolated, untouched. But as night fell, a strange unease began to settle over me. It wasn't anything specific, just an overwhelming feeling that something was off. I kept pushing it down, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. We sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing. Then, just as I was about to take a sip of water, I heard something. A soft rustle in the bushes, too deliberate to be an animal. Everyone else was distracted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling persisted. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the camp. A sudden movement in the tree line caught my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. My heart started to race. I forced myself to smile and join the conversation, but I couldn't ignore the growing discomfort gnawing at me. Around midnight, we decided to head to bed. The forest was pitch black now, the fire a dying glow in the distance. I crawled into my tent, trying to ignore the eerie silence of the night. I zipped it up, rolled into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. There was something out there. I could feel it. Every rustle of the wind in the trees, every crack of a twig seemed too loud, too close. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves. But the longer I lay there, the more restless I became. Then, a sound pierced the night, a soft whisper, just outside my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the wind, not the trees, it was a voice, faint but distinct. "Help. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me." I reached for the zipper of my tent, my fingers trembling. I had to know who or what was out there. I slowly unzipped the flap and poked my head out, scanning the darkness. The forest was still. No movement, no sounds, just the rustling of leaves. Then, I heard it again, right behind me. "Help me." I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing, just the empty space inside my tent, the dark forest outside. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to zip the tent back up, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I lay still, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, this time louder. Help me, please. This time, it didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a plea, like something trapped. My skin prickled with fear, and I fought the urge to scream. What was happening? Who was calling out for help? I could feel the tension in the air, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. I listened carefully, my pulse hammering in my ears. And that's when I heard something that froze my blood. A voice, deep and rasping, came from just outside my tent. I'm behind you. I didn't move. I couldn't. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear its soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around my tent. The world felt suffocating. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the side of my tent sent me flying out of my sleeping bag, heart racing. I scrambled to turn on my flashlight, but the beam shook so violently I could barely focus it. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice familiar, but wrong. You're not alone. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. The forest was still. I turned it off and on again, the beam cutting through the night. That's when I saw it, a figure, a face, pale and distorted, staring at me through the fabric of the tent. I gasped, heart in my throat. It vanished instantly, as if it had never been there at all. I threw the tent open and bolted outside, my friends standing around the fire. I could hardly speak, but when I managed to, all I could say was that we needed to leave. Now, we packed up in a hurry, our hearts pounding in our chests, and we didn't stop until we were miles away. The most terrifying part, when we looked at the photos we had taken earlier in the day, one image stood out. A shot of the trees with the camp in the background. In the upper corner of the photo, barely visible, was a figure tall and thin, with hollow, staring eyes. It was the face I had seen in the tent. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. My friends and I, Rachel, Tom, and Jake, had been planning our camping trip for weeks. We chose a remote site deep in the woods, far away from city lights and noise, promising ourselves a weekend of relaxation and adventure. The air was crisp when we arrived, the sun shining bright overhead as we set up our tents by a small, glimmering lake. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the trees, creating an atmosphere that was both cozy and a little unnerving. After a while, Rachel suggested we play a game of truth or dare, which seemed harmless enough. We laughed, teased each other, and drank a few beers while the fire crackled. As the night wore on, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the forest and muffling the sounds of the night. The laughter died down, and a strange quiet settled over us, broken only by the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. That's when I noticed the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just beyond the reach of our firelight. Hey, did anyone else feel that? I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Jake laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Feel what? He said. The thrill of camping. Come on, we're fine. We decided to head to our tents for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. Suddenly, I heard something else, a faint whispering that seemed to float through the air. I sat up, straining to listen. The voices were indistinct, but they felt close, too close. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Rachel, I whispered, not wanting to alarm her. Do you hear that? She groaned and pulled the sleeping bag over her head. Hear what? Just go to sleep. But I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt compelled to get out of my tent. I unzipped it quietly and stepped out, the cool air hitting my skin. The fog was thick, swirling around me, and the fire had died down to embers, casting dim, flickering shadows. I turned toward the woods where the whispers seemed to come from. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying gently. I felt drawn to them, as if the whispers were calling my name. Just as I took a step forward, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned to find Jake standing there, looking equally bewildered. Did you hear it too? He asked, his eyes wide with fear. Yeah, I replied, glancing back toward the trees. It's coming from over there. We stood there for a moment, caught between curiosity and dread. when Tom and Rachel emerged from their tents, groggy and confused. "What's going on?" Tom asked, rubbing his eyes. "We heard voices," I explained, and as I did, the whispers intensified, almost as if they were responding to us. The four of us stood together, the fear palpable in the air. Suddenly, as if on cue, the whispers faded, and a silence fell over the woods. We looked at each other, our breaths visible in the chilly night air. "Let's get back to the fire," Rachel said, her voice shaky. We hurried back, relieved to be in the warmth of the remaining embers. As we sat together, the tension slowly eased, though we couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us that night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook us, and we all crawled back into our tents, vowing to leave early in the morning. When dawn broke, we packed up quickly, eager to escape the strange occurrences of the night before. We drove home with a sense of relief, but deep down, I knew the forest held secrets I would never understand. To this day, I wonder what those whispers meant and if they were meant for us at all. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends. We drove to a secluded area, far from the noise of the city, hoping to escape the pressures of our everyday lives. There were 5 of us, my friends Jake, Sarah, Lily, and Mark. We pitched our tents under the trees, the sound of the crackling fire providing a comforting backdrop to our laughter. As night fell, the woods transformed, the shadows deepened, and the familiar sounds of the forest turned ominous. I suggested we tell ghost stories, thinking it would be a laugh. But as we shared tales of lost souls and wandering spirits, I could feel an unsettling chill creeping in. Jokingly, Jake dared us to go for a midnight hike to explore the woods. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the darkness. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy, and every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. As we walked deeper, I noticed that the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. That's when we heard a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. Was it a wolf? The sound sent a shiver down my spine. We decided to press on, hoping to laugh it off once we were back at camp. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The howling returned, closer this time, accompanied by a faint rustling. Suddenly, Mark, who had been trailing behind, screamed. We turned to see him pointing toward a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a tall silhouette, swaying slightly, its outline obscured by the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to make out any details. I felt paralyzed, fear gripping me like a vice. "Is that a person?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before anyone could respond, the figure lurched forward. Panic erupted among us. We turned to run, but my foot snagged on a root, and I fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled after my friends. We burst back into the clearing, breathless and shaken. I quickly checked to see if everyone was okay. Mark was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that thing?" he gasped. "I don't know, but we should pack up and leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We hurriedly gathered our things, our earlier bravado completely forgotten. As we worked, the haunting howl rang out again, echoing in the distance. It felt like the forest itself was alive, mocking our fear. With our gear hastily stuffed into backpacks, we turned to leave when Jake suddenly froze, his eyes wide. "The fire," he said, pointing. The flames had flared up unexpectedly, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. We had extinguished it before heading into the woods, but now it blazed brighter than ever, illuminating the trees around us. "What the hell?" Lily exclaimed. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized something was off. The firelight revealed a pattern in the dirt around it, something we hadn't seen before. Scratches and markings that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. It looked like words, but twisted, as if they had been clawed into the ground. "Get away from the fire," I yelled, panic rising again. We stumbled backward, eyes locked on the flames. The howls returned, but now they were accompanied by a rustling sound, like branches snapping. Shadows danced wildly around us, the flames illuminating the silhouettes of figures hiding just outside the light's reach. We were trapped. Then, just as we were about to bolt, The fire suddenly died down to embers, plunging us into darkness once more. The figures became clear now, dozens of them, watching silently from the tree line, their faces obscured by the night. In a flash, I recalled a story I'd heard years ago, about a camping group that vanished without a trace, the only clue being markings found in the dirt. They had been lured into the woods by the firelight, just like we had been. In that moment, we understood. We weren't just in a haunted forest. We were part of a sinister game, and we had unknowingly walked into their territory. With adrenaline pumping, we bolted toward the path that led back to our car. As we ran, I could hear their footsteps behind us, almost mocking. I glanced back one last time and saw them emerging from the shadows, eyes glinting like hungry predators. We reached the car, breathless and terrified, and peeled away from the campsite, leaving behind the twisted horror of the woods. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was a figure standing by the dying embers, watching us leave, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time I felt their presence. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, a simple camping trip with a few friends in a remote spot we'd hiked to many times before. The kind of place where the trees are thick and the nights are dark, but that's what made it peaceful. We arrived late in the afternoon, set up camp near the edge of a small, fast-moving creek, and sat around the fire, talking, laughing, and enjoying the fading sunlight. As the fire crackled, the shadows grew long and the cold night air settled in. I was exhausted, so I retreated to my tent first. The others stayed by the fire, their voices fading as I closed the zipper behind me. I could hear the creek rushing, the wind through the trees, and the occasional pop of the fire. I was just starting to drift off when a sudden thud against my tent made me sit up straight. My heart hammered in my chest as I listened. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, brushing against the fabric. But the sound came again, closer this time, and then a scraping noise, like something dragging along the ground. I held my breath, hoping it was nothing. But when the sound came a third time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Slowly, I unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. The campfire was still burning, but my friends were no longer sitting around it. I couldn't see anyone, but the fire was still there, crackling merrily. I called out to them, my voice a little shaky. No answer. My pulse quickened, and a cold chill ran through me. Something was wrong. I crawled out of the tent, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The night was so still now, no sounds of the wind, no movement from the forest. I looked around the campsite, but there was no sign of anyone. The fire burned low, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The woods seemed silent, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it again. A low, dragging sound, coming from the edge of the trees. I froze. This time, it wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate, slow, almost methodical. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the dark, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, tall, thin, and unnaturally bent. I blinked and it was gone. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking. I backed toward the fire, my heart in my throat. The dragging sound continued, getting closer. And then, as if to taunt me, I heard a voice, soft, almost whispering, but unmistakable, come closer. The voice was unmistakably one of my friends, but it was wrong, distorted, like it was coming from a distance or through a thick fog. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave without finding them. I crept toward the trees, my breath coming in short gasps, the dragging sound getting louder. I stepped carefully, trying not to make a sound. I stopped just at the edge of the forest, peering into the dark. The light from the fire barely reached this far. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. My friend's backpack, lying on the ground, half buried under fallen leaves. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was tall and hunched, its face pale, eyes wide and gleaming. I gasped, dropping the flashlight, the beam illuminating the figure for just a moment before it hit the ground. The figure tilted its head at me, and I could see that it was wearing one of my friend's jackets, but the face wasn't my friend's face. It was wrong. Where are they? I shouted, backing away. The figure made no move toward me, just stood there staring, its mouth twitching in what looked like a grin. I turned and bolted back to the fire, feeling the eerie sensation of being followed. When I reached the camp, I stopped dead in my tracks. My friends were sitting around the fire again, just as I had left them, but there was something off about them. They weren't moving, they weren't talking. Their eyes were open, but vacant, lifeless. I took a shaky step toward them, and that's when I realized none of them were breathing. The realization hit me like a wave. I had been talking to things in the forest. They weren't my friends, not anymore. They were something else, something that had taken their shapes. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back toward the forest, my eyes darting to the shadows. The hunched figure was no longer there, but I could feel it watching me. I ran. As I sprinted, I thought I saw figures moving in the periphery of the trees, shapes that resembled people, but too tall, too twisted. The sound of dragging feet followed me all the way back to the car. When I finally made it out of the woods, I never went back. The truth hit me too late. I didn't just witness something unnatural. I had stumbled across something that was waiting, patiently, for the next campfire. We'd set up camp by a quiet lake, surrounded by trees that stretched up like towering giants. We were far enough from any civilization that it felt like we were in our own little world. We had the usual setup, a campfire crackling in the center, tents scattered around, and the smell of roasting marshmallows filling the air. The night had fallen swiftly, and we were all sitting around the fire, laughing and talking. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the forest. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then, without warning, the silence broke. It wasn't the usual rustling of wind or the chirping of crickets. This was something else. A strange noise echoed from deeper in the forest. At first, we all looked at each other, trying to place it. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. It came in short bursts, then stopped, only to start again, this time closer. I stood up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My friends noticed it too. One of them, Jake, grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the trees, but we saw nothing. The dragging sound continued, but now it was getting more erratic, more frantic. It sounded like whatever was out there was in a hurry. Maybe it's an animal, one of my friends suggested, but I could tell from the way he said it that he didn't believe it. No animal moves like that. The air seemed to grow colder. The fire crackled and popped, but it didn't provide much warmth against the chill that had set in. We all huddled closer, unsure of what to do. Then the sound stopped, as abruptly as it had started. There was only silence now, but it felt thick, heavy, like something was waiting just outside the edge of the firelight. We tried to brush it off and return to our seats, though none of us could truly relax. Then, another noise cut through the quiet, closer this time. The same dragging sound, followed by what could only be described as a low, guttural moan. It sent a shiver down my spine. Jake, clearly on edge, stood up again, shining the flashlight towards the woods. We all held our breath. The beam of light moved across the dark trees, illuminating nothing. But just as Jake was about to lower the light, something caught his eye. At the edge of the trees, there was a figure standing. A tall, thin silhouette, almost blending with the shadows, except for the faint, eerie gleam of eyes that shone back at us. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice shaking. No answer. The figure didn't move, but I swore I could feel its presence pressing in on us, like it was waiting for something. The air felt thick, like it was charged with static. We all stood, frozen in place, not daring to make a move. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared back into the woods. No movement, no sound, just gone. We stood in silence, processing what we'd just seen. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. We were deep in the woods, miles from any help. What if we were being watched? What if something, or someone was waiting for the right moment to strike? But after a long pause, Jake finally spoke. "I think we should head back to the car. Now." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, and we all agreed without a word. But when we started to pack up our things, that's when the real horror began. We hadn't noticed it before, but there were footprints around our camp, not animal tracks, but human ones. They were fresh, the kind that would only appear in the soft dirt after a rain. And they circled our camp, getting closer with each round. That's when we all heard it. The sound of something heavy dragging along the ground, this time directly behind us. My heart raced. We turned around, and for the briefest moment, we saw it. A pale, gaunt face peering out from behind a tree, its eyes locked on us. But when we blinked, it was gone. We didn't hesitate anymore. We grabbed our gear and ran, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The dragging sound followed us, growing louder, like whatever was chasing us was just a step behind. We didn't stop until we reached the car, but as I sat there, trying to calm my breath, something gnawed at me. We had been so focused on what was chasing us, so terrified of what we had seen in the woods, we didn't realize that the thing we had been running from was already inside the car. I turned to look in the back seat, where I had left my bag earlier. But it wasn't just my bag that was there. There, in the reflection of the window, was the same pale face we'd seen in the woods, its eyes wide and staring directly at me. I'll never forget the smile that spread across its face, just as the car door clicked shut behind me. We were a group of 5 friends, all of us desperate for a break from the chaos of everyday life. So, we rented a remote cabin tucked deep in the woods for a weekend of solitude. No phones, no distractions, just us, the trees, and the stars. It seemed perfect. The cabin was old, but charming, with wooden floors that creaked under our feet and a fireplace that crackled warmly in the living room. The first evening passed in a blur of laughter and drinks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a chill settled over the woods, and the wind began to pick up. It rattled the windows and howled through the trees like a warning, but no one took it seriously. We were having too much fun. That night, after we'd gone to bed, I woke up suddenly. The air in the room felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on me. At first, I chalked it up to the late hour, but then I heard it soft tapping at the window. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart began to race. I lay still, holding my breath, hoping it would stop. The tapping continued. Slowly, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the window. I could barely make out the trees outside, their outlines swaying in the dim moonlight. Then I saw a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. It was tall, too tall, its face hidden in shadow. It stood perfectly still. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. Was it a person, or something worse? The tapping grew louder, more frantic, like a desperate plea. I didn't want to wake the others, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a bird or a branch, but I knew deep down it was and single quotes t. Eventually, the tapping stopped, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, then hours, and just when I was beginning to think I'd imagined it, a knock came at the door. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. I froze. The others were deep asleep. I couldn't bring myself to go to them. I could only lie there, listening, praying it would stop. The knock came again, and this time I heard a voice. It was low, barely above a whisper, but it sent ice through my veins. Let me in. I wanted to scream, to wake everyone, but I couldn't move. I didn't even want to look at the door. The voice came again, more urgent this time. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I gripped the covers, my knuckles white, waiting for something to happen. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The woods fell silent again. I didn't know how long I lay there, staring at the door, unable to move. The silence pressed in on me like a heavy weight. At dawn, I crept out of bed, careful not to wake the others. The house was still and quiet. I stood by the door, staring at the handle, half expecting it to turn on its own. But nothing happened. I wasn't sure what I expected to find when I opened it, but I did. I stepped into the hallway, and everything seemed normal. The house was unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me. Something not human. When we gathered in the kitchen later, I told my friends what had happened. They all laughed it off, saying it was just my imagination. But then Sarah, one of the girls in our group, spoke up. Her voice was trembling as she described hearing soft whispers coming from the woods the previous night. A voice that wasn't hers. None of us had heard anything like that before. We all thought it was just a coincidence, but we couldn't shake the unease that lingered over the rest of the day. That evening, we decided to leave early. The air felt wrong, thick with an unspoken tension. As we packed the car, I happened to glance at the door again. The same one I had heard the knocking at. To my horror, the doorknob was now covered in fresh scratches, deep gouges, as though something or someone had been clawing at it from the other side. We didn't stay another minute. As we drove away, I tried to rationalize it. But I knew deep down that something had been in that cabin with us. Something that wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It wasn't until later, when I looked through the photos from the trip, that I found the final, chilling detail. In one of the pictures we had taken of the cabin from the front yard, there was a figure standing just behind the window. Barely visible, it was the same tall figure I had seen outside the night before, its face still hidden in shadow. And in that moment, I realized the truth. We had never been alone in that cabin. It had been watching us the entire time. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am, sharing a story that still keeps me up at night. A few years ago, my friends and I rented a cabin for a weekend getaway. It wasn't an extravagant place, but it was tucked away in a secluded part of the forest, far from civilization. Perfect for a group of friends looking to disconnect. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the air crisp with the scent of pine. We settled in, made ourselves comfortable, and as evening fell, we gathered around the fireplace. It felt perfect, but things began to feel off. At first, I thought it was the isolation or maybe the silence that surrounded the cabin, but it was more than that. It felt like we were being watched. Around midnight, we decided to go to bed. The house grew quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wood settling. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the sense of unease that gnawed at me. It wasn't long before I heard something faint. At first, like soft tapping at my window. I convinced myself it was just the wind, the trees brushing against the house. But then it came again, louder. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone or something was knocking at my window. I lay there, paralyzed, heart pounding in my chest. The knocks grew faster, then stopped. I didn't dare look out the window. Instead, I turned on my side, trying to ignore it, willing myself to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. I heard the sounds again, but this time they weren't from the window. It was at the door, slow, deliberate knocks, as if someone was waiting for me to answer. I sat up in bed, frozen, and listened. Then came the voice. "Let me in." It was faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if it was real, but it felt like it was coming from right outside my door. My heart raced. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The voice came again, this time more insistent. "Let me in." I finally worked up the courage to peek through the crack in the door, but there was nothing. No one. Just the dark, empty hallway. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to the others. They were all still sound asleep when I woke up, so I kept my nerves to myself. But as we sat around the breakfast table, one of my friends, Laura, spoke up. "I heard something weird last night," she said, her voice shaky. Like, knocking at my window. It was like someone was outside. I thought I was just imagining it, but now I'm not sure. The others exchanged uneasy looks, but no one said much. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't the only one. Later that day, we decided to take a walk in the woods to clear our heads. We spent hours hiking, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the way the trees seemed to close in around us, the unnatural silence that seemed to follow us wherever we went. It wasn't normal. That evening, we sat around the fire again, trying to enjoy the night. But the strange feeling lingered, like an invisible presence watching us. When we went to bed, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. I kept hearing things outside, the same tapping, the same whispering. It was like it was trying to get in. But what terrified me the most was when I heard someone whisper my name. It was clear as day. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering, and rushed to the window. There was nothing there. The woods were silent, unnervingly so. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. I couldn't explain it. I had to stay calm. The next morning, we packed up early. None of us spoke much, but there was an unspoken understanding. We were all on edge, and none of us wanted to stay another night. As we walked to the car, I glanced back at the cabin. That's when I saw at the front door. It was wide open. We had all locked it the night before. I didn't wait to investigate. We piled into the car and drove off in a hurry. But, as we left the woods behind, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror just for a second. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. I don't know who or what it was, but I'll never forget the feeling. It was like we were being followed, watched by something that wasn't quite human. After that weekend, I tried to forget it. I told myself it was all in my head, just a trick of the mind. But when I looked at the photos we took during the trip, I saw something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, standing at the cabin's doorway, was a shadowy figure, just out of focus, and it wasn't any of us. To this day, I don't know what we encountered, but I know one thing for sure: whatever it wasn't human. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a chance to disconnect and unwind. My friends and I were overdue for a weekend getaway. So, when we found a secluded cabin in the woods, we jumped at the opportunity. We arrived late Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was exactly what we'd hoped for: old, rustic, and off the beaten path. There was something charming about the creaky floors and the smell of pine in the air. We gathered around the fireplace, laughing and reminiscing, settling in for what promised to be a peaceful weekend. But that first night, something felt off. As the fire crackled, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with a strange rhythm. It wasn't the kind of wind that howls, it was like something was tapping on the walls. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just branches brushing against the wood. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, like a soft tap on the front door. I glanced at my friends, but no one seemed to notice. The knock came again, this time louder, followed by a low scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy along the floor. I froze, heart pounding. It wasn't just the wind. The knocking had a deliberate, almost human quality to it. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No one responded immediately. So I stood up and walked to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. I heard nothing but the wind outside, howling against the trees. I slowly backed away, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The night passed in a strange haze. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, hearing the occasional knock on the door and the unsettling scraping sound. But when I checked again, no one was outside. The cabin was still. The next morning, I brushed it off. It had been a long drive, and we were all exhausted, but when we stepped outside to explore the woods, I noticed something strange: footprints in the snow leading toward the cabin, fresh and deep. They weren't from any of us. They circled the cabin before fading into the trees. I didn't say anything at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods felt too quiet, like the trees were watching us, waiting. We spent the day hiking and enjoying the outdoors, but that night, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking just beyond the window. I quietly got up, careful not to wake the others, and peeked outside. Nothing, just the snow-covered ground and the trees, swaying in the wind. But then I saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, moving between the trees. It didn't seem to belong to anything. The figure moved with unnatural grace, its silhouette stretching across the snow. I stared for a moment, trying to make sense of it, but when I blinked, it was gone. I bolted back to my bed, my heart racing. I lay there, wide awake, listening, and then I heard the knock. Soft at first, then harder, followed by a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was ragged, almost distorted. I didn't know who it was or what it wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I stayed still, too terrified to move, listening as the knocking came again, louder this time, right against the door. It didn't stop. Not until morning. The next day, I told my friends about what happened. They thought I was just spooked, maybe imagining things, but they agreed to leave early. As we packed up the car, I noticed something else. The footprints from the day before weren't just around the cabin, they were leading toward the woods, and they were fresh, but they didn't look like human footprints. They were too large, too deep, and there was something wrong about them. They circled around the cabin, but then, right by the door, there were more marks. Scratches, gouges in the wood, like something had been clawing at it from the outside. We didn't wait around to investigate. We left, and as we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The trees surrounding it were unnaturally still, the wind completely absent. We never went back, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed us. Something that had been waiting for us in those woods. Something that wanted in. What I didn't realize until later was that the knocking wasn't the scariest part. It was the voice, the one that whispered, "Let me in," because when I went back through the photos we took that weekend, I noticed something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, just outside the window, there's a figure standing in the trees, and it's smiling. I've spent years working as a park ranger in the deep woods. My shifts usually consisted of monitoring trails, checking campsites, and ensuring visitors adhered to safety guidelines. Autumn had set in, painting the forest in a tapestry of orange and crimson. The air felt electric, tinged with an anticipation I couldn't quite shake. On this particular evening, I was tasked with patrolling a remote campsite that had recently reported some strange disturbances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the narrow trail leading to the site. The shadows grew longer, twisting into menacing shapes among the trees. The silence felt thick, almost suffocating. I brushed off the unsettling feeling and focused on my job. After all, I had encountered my fair share of oddities in the woods. When I arrived at the campsite, I noticed it was unusually quiet. The fire pit lay cold, and the tents stood like sentinels, their flaps flapping gently in the breeze. I called out to see if anyone was around, but received no answer. A tingle of unease prickled my spine. I began checking the tents one by one. The first tent was empty, save for some gear strewn about. The second tent, however, caught my attention. I unzipped the flap and peered inside. It was dark, the light from my flashlight barely illuminating the space. I stepped in and felt a chill sweep over me. The sleeping bags were rolled up, but something was off. There was a half-eaten granola bar lying on the ground, and a backpack was haphazardly tossed in the corner, as if someone had left in a hurry. My instincts kicked in, and I quickly exited the tent. I decided to check the surrounding area. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt the air grow heavier. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but it carried with it an unsettling whisper. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was just being paranoid. That's when I heard a faint sound, almost like a child laughing. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, and started walking towards the direction of the sound. The laughter echoed in a way that sent chills down my spine. It was innocent, yet the deeper I went into the woods, the more distorted it became. It was laced with a hint of something dark, something wrong. As I ventured deeper, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to whoever had been camping. But as I drew closer, the laughter ceased, replaced by a profound silence. I stepped into a clearing and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, in the center, stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree lay a circle of stones, each one covered in strange markings. I crouched to examine them, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. Just then, I heard rustling behind me. I whipped around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there. I was alone, or so I thought. Suddenly, a sharp whisper cut through the air, sending icy fingers creeping up my spine. It was a voice, chillingly familiar, echoing my name. I stumbled backward, heart racing, realizing it sounded just like my sister. Confused and terrified, I called out, asking if anyone was there. The whispers intensified, now blending into a cacophony of voices, all calling my name. My heart pounded louder, drowning out the chaos. I felt disoriented, panic threatening to take hold. Then I spotted something moving in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. I trained my flashlight on it, revealing a face that made my blood run cold. It was a child, eyes wide and terrified, a look of pure horror etched on her face. I rushed toward her, ready to ask if she was lost. But as I reached her, she opened her mouth, and an unearthly scream erupted from her. The sound shattered the night, reverberating in my chest. I stumbled backward, realizing the child's face was not just frightened, but twisted, warped into something inhuman. I turned to run, but felt a tug on my shirt, yanking me back. I looked down to see skeletal hands emerging from the ground, grasping at me. I screamed and broke free, sprinting back toward the trail, adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, I locked the doors, heart racing, hands trembling. I looked back at the woods, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The eerie laughter had returned, ringing in my ears, echoing my deepest fears. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my truck, shaken, the forest looming dark and silent around me. As dawn broke, I vowed never to return to that spot, never to speak of it again. I thought about the child I saw, and the sinister whispers that echoed through the trees. I knew one thing for certain: the woods were alive with secrets, and some truths were best left buried. I had been a park ranger for a few years, spending countless nights in the woods and feeling a sense of peace in the rustling leaves and the sounds of nature. But that October night, everything changed. The sky was dark, thick clouds cloaking the moon, and the air was heavy with an unsettling stillness. As I patrolled the trails, the crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound, making me hyper-aware of my surroundings. I was nearing a remote campsite when my radio crackled to life. A distressed voice came through. A group of campers had reported hearing strange noises outside their tents. The father insisted it sounded like someone or something was moving around their campsite, heavy footfalls and a low growl. I tried to calm him down, assuring him that it was probably just a bear, but I could hear the fear in his voice. After gathering my gear, I set off toward the campsite. The path was winding and overgrown, making it hard to see far ahead. With my flashlight cutting through the darkness, the trees cast long, eerie shadows that danced around me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I pressed forward, the feeling of being watched creeping in. When I finally reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the unsettling silence. I called out, but there was no response. I stepped closer and found the tent zipped up tight, a warning sign that sent a chill down my spine. I unzipped the door and peeked inside. It was empty, the sleeping bags neatly arranged as if no one had ever been there. My heart raced as I turned to look around the campsite. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise from the bushes nearby. I whipped around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, moving with a jerky, unsettling gait. I called out, trying to sound authoritative, but my voice cracked. The figure stopped and turned its head slowly, revealing hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb the light. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through me. I remembered my training and reached for my radio, but the words got stuck in my throat. The figure didn't advance. It simply stood there, watching me. The woods around us felt like they were holding their breath, the air thick with anticipation. I turned and sprinted back down the path, my mind racing. I could hear branches snapping behind me and the sound of something following, moving faster than it should have been. As I ran, I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me, the trees towering like sentinels. I burst out onto the main trail and didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and finally got inside, slamming the door shut. I took a moment to catch my breath before calling for backup, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, but inside I was a mess. While I waited for the other rangers to arrive, I decided to circle back to the campsite. Maybe I could find the family and lead them to safety. As I approached, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The area looked different, almost distorted. I scanned the trees but saw no sign of the figure. The tent was still zipped up tight, and the campsite was eerily quiet. I crept closer, my flashlight beam trembling. I unzipped the tent once more, but this time, it was empty. My heart sank. Where had they gone? A rustling noise drew my attention again, and I turned just in time to see the figure dart between the trees. Panic surged, and I turned to run, but as I did, I tripped over something hidden in the leaves. I fell forward and looked back. The figure was right there, only inches from me. But as I scrambled to my feet, something strange happened. The creature changed shape, morphing into the father from the camping family, his face twisted with fear. I blinked, and he vanished, replaced by shadows that danced among the trees. I stumbled back toward the road, my mind racing with confusion. Just as I reached the trailhead, the other rangers arrived. I told them everything. But as we searched the woods, we found nothing, no campers, no sign of a struggle, just an overwhelming silence. Days later, the park officials declared the area closed until further notice. But sometimes, when I walk the trails alone at night, I can still hear the rustling of leaves and that haunting growl. I wonder if the woods still hold the family, or if they became part of something far darker. The figure I saw, the one that looked like the father, was never found, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered in those woods still lingers, watching and waiting. We were excited for our weekend camping trip, the four of us eager to escape the grind of everyday life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we arrived at our chosen spot. The site was remote, surrounded by dense woods that promised solitude and adventure. We set up our tents, made a campfire, and cooked hot dogs while sharing stories of past trips, laughing under the stars. As night enveloped the forest, a chill set in. We huddled closer to the fire, and Yana, always the jokester, suggested we play a game. She proposed truth or scare, a twist on the classic game. Each person had to tell a scary story or share a truth that no one else knew. It was all in good fun until it was my turn. With the fire crackling and shadows dancing around us, I began to tell the tale of a local legend, an old park ranger who vanished in the woods decades ago. They say he was searching for something he never found, and on moonless nights, you can still hear his chains rattling as he roams, looking for anyone who dares to camp in his territory. As I spoke, I noticed a flicker of unease in my friend's eyes, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the spooky atmosphere. After my story, we decided to take a short hike before bed. The darkness pressed in around us, the trees towering like silent sentinels. We laughed nervously, trying to keep the mood light, but the deeper we ventured into the woods, the more the sounds of nature seemed to fade. It was eerily quiet, and I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Suddenly, from somewhere in the darkness, we heard a distinct clanking sound, like metal against metal. My heart raced as we stopped in our tracks, exchanging worried glances. It echoed through the trees, louder now, like chains being dragged across the ground. Gina's face turned pale, and I could see her grip tightening around the flashlight she held. "Let's get back to camp," I suggested, trying to sound calm. We turned to retrace our steps, but the clanking grew louder, more frantic. Panic surged through us, and we broke into a sprint, the beam of our flashlights bobbing erratically as we stumbled through the underbrush. I could hear my friends gasping behind me, their breaths coming in quick bursts. Then we saw lights, flickering in the distance, moving slowly toward us through the trees. They were lanterns, glowing eerily in the dark. My instinct screamed to run, but curiosity held me in place for a moment too long. I wanted to see what was coming. The lanterns approached, revealing figures shrouded in shadows, their faces obscured by dark hoods. "Hide," I shouted, and we dove into the nearest thicket, hearts pounding in our chests. We crouched low, the clanking chains now deafening. Through the gaps in the bushes, we watched as the figures moved closer, each one carrying a lantern that illuminated their strange, unnatural movements. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. They walked in a slow, deliberate line, each step synchronized, and I could see that they were bound together by chains. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me these weren't just people. They looked like some kind of ghostly procession. As they passed, I caught a glimpse of their faces, hidden behind the hoods but pale and sunken, as if they had emerged from a grave. Then, suddenly, they stopped. One of them turned, their lantern light sweeping across the bushes where we hid. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if sensing our presence, and then continued on, the group moving as one again. We waited, terrified and breathless, until the sounds faded into the distance. When we finally emerged from our hiding place, dawn was breaking, casting a pale light through the trees. We hurried back to camp, shaken but relieved to find our tents untouched. But as we approached, a chilling sight awaited us. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered, and next to it, scratched into the dirt, were the words "You should have stayed" hidden. In that moment, a wave of terror washed over us. We packed our things in silence, hearts racing, and bolted for the car. vowing never to return. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, and for a brief second, I could have sworn I saw the same figures standing among the trees, their lanterns flickering like dying stars. It started as a quiet night, the kind where you feel the weight of the silence pressing against your ears. I was dog-sitting for a friend at their house in the countryside. They had warned me it could get lonely out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and open fields, but I had shrugged it off. I enjoyed solitude, and I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was wrong. The house was small, cozy, with large windows that overlooked the woods. The dog, a large shepherd mix, had been restless all evening, pacing near the back door. I figured he just missed his owners. The night stretched on uneventfully. I fed him, let him out into the yard for a while, and finally settled on the couch to watch some TV. Around 11, I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like something rustling against the side of the house. I muted the TV and listened, but everything had gone silent. I chalked it up to the wind. Living in the city had dulled my sense of how noisy the countryside could be. The dog, however, didn't seem convinced. He stood in the middle of the room, ears pricked, staring at the back door. It was unnerving, but I brushed it off. I called him over, and he reluctantly lay at my feet. I tried to focus on the show, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt colder, as if the warmth had seeped out through invisible cracks. At midnight, the sound came again. This time, it was louder. It wasn't just rustling. It was a deliberate, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground outside. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and walked to the back door. The dog followed, his fur bristling. I flipped on the porch light. The yard was empty, the woods beyond it still and dark. The sound had stopped. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing unusual. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside to get a better look. The cold air stung my skin as I peered into the shadows. That was when the dog began to growl. A low, guttural sound that I had never heard from him before. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the yard, where the light didn't quite reach. I followed his gaze, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A tall, misshapen figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. I blinked, and it was gone. My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a shadow. But the dog's growl deepened, and his body tensed as if ready to pounce. I backed into the house, locking the door behind me. The dog barked once, sharply, then fell silent. I tried to calm myself. I told myself there was nothing out there, that my imagination was running wild. But the unease didn't leave me. I decided to stay awake, just in case. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. The dog had settled at my feet again, but his ears twitched at every creak and groan of the house. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of knocking. It was soft but insistent, coming from the back door. The clock on the wall read 3 in the morning. My heart raced as I got up and crept toward the door. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. I glanced through the window but saw nothing. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. Then the knocking stopped. A moment of silence followed, then a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but I could hear it clearly. "Let me in." My blood turned to ice. The voice was familiar. It was my own. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The dog began barking furiously, his body pressed against the door as if trying to protect me. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." The doorknob rattled, and the dog's barking grew frantic. I didn't know what to do. My hands shook as I grabbed a flashlight and shined it out the window. The yard was empty. The voice stopped, and so did the dog. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I went outside to look for any signs of what had happened. There were no footprints, no disturbed soil, nothing. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something on the door. Scratched into the wood, deep and jagged, were the words I had heard all night. "Let me in." The dog refused to go near the door for the rest of the day. Neither of us ever stayed in that house again. I've seen a lot of strange things, animals behaving oddly, Signs of storms that seemed to form out of nowhere, but nothing could prepare me for the night I had last spring. That night, I realized how much the forest hides from us. It all started as a routine patrol. The weather was turning cold, and I was assigned to a more isolated part of the park, an area where few people ventured. There was a small cabin near the trailhead, and my job was to check that everything was secure, ensuring no one had been up to mischief. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. As I made my way down the winding path, the trees were dense, blocking most of the fading daylight. The usual noises of the forest had quieted, which struck me as odd. It wasn't completely silent, but it felt like the woods were holding their breath. The birds, the wind, even the rustling of leaves had all faded. I reached the cabin just as night was beginning to fall. The air had turned chilly, and a dense fog began rolling in. I walked around the perimeter, checked the windows, and made sure the door was locked. The place felt abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I returned to the front of the cabin, ready to head back when I heard a noise behind me, something subtle, but distinct. A faint scraping sound, as if something was dragging across the wooden floor inside the cabin. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My flashlight flickered as I tried to peer through the fog in the cabin's windows. There was no movement, but that sound continued, slow, deliberate. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I took a few cautious steps back toward the cabin door, considering my options. The scraping sound continued, now joined by a soft thumping. It was almost rhythmic, like footsteps. I had to check. I pulled out my keys and hesitated for just a second before unlocking the door. I swung it open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. The inside of the cabin was empty. No animals, no intruders, just dust and old furniture. But the scraping sound, it stopped the moment I stepped inside. I shined my flashlight across the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I noticed something strange. The floorboards, they were new. I'd been in this cabin many times before, and the floor had always been worn, creaking underfoot. But now, the boards looked fresh, freshly laid, and unnaturally smooth. My heart started racing. I knelt down to examine the floor more closely, and that's when I saw a small, jagged crack at the edge of one of the boards. Something was behind it. I used my flashlight to peer into the crack and saw a flash of white. I leaned in closer, instinctively reaching out to touch the crack. That's when the scraping sound returned. It was louder this time, right behind me, coming from just inside the walls. I jerked around, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to think, but every instinct screamed at me to run. The scraping didn't stop, and now there was a low, guttural breathing sound coming from within the walls of the cabin. One had to get out of there. I backed toward the door, fumbling for my keys, but before I could turn the handle, the breathing stopped. And then, something much worse happened. The floorboards beneath me creaked, but not in the usual way. It was as if something heavy was moving below the ground, crawling beneath the floor. I stepped back, my flashlight casting a trembling beam across the cabin. Then, with a sickening crack, the floorboard where I had been kneeling snapped upward. I jumped back, terrified, but nothing emerged from the hole. The scraping had stopped, and all I could hear was my own heavy breathing. I didn't wait another second. I rushed out of the cabin, slammed the door shut, and sprinted back down the trail, not stopping until I reached the ranger station. It wasn't until the next morning that I returned with a colleague to investigate the cabin. We pried up the floorboards, expecting to find the usual critters or perhaps an old forgotten stash of supplies. Instead, we found a hole beneath the floor, but no signs of any animals. What we did find were several old, decayed personal items, clothes, shoes, and a faded journal. It looked like someone had lived there once, but there was no record of any other park rangers ever having occupied the cabin. As I flipped through the journal, the last entry sent a cold chill through me. It's not just the trees that watch. Something else is out there, waiting for us to leave. We never spoke about that night again. My friends and I were excited for a weekend getaway. We rented a cabin in a remote area, far away from the noise and chaos of city life. None of us were really into anything spooky, and we thought it would be a peaceful escape. The cabin itself was old but charming, with wood-paneled walls and an inviting fireplace. We arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked, and decided to explore the surrounding woods. There were no trails, just thick, dense trees that seemed to go on forever. It was peaceful, almost a quiet. I felt like we were the only people on Earth, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. That evening, after dinner, we gathered around the fireplace and told stories. We laughed a lot, drank wine, and enjoyed each other's company. But as night fell, the wind picked up. It howled against the windows, and the old house creaked under the pressure. We joked about the house being haunted, but it was all in good fun until things took a turn. Around midnight, we heard something from the back of the cabin. It sounded like a door creaking, followed by heavy footsteps. At first, we thought it was just the house settling. But when the footsteps grew louder and closer, I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. The others looked at me, their faces as confused as mine. But no one said anything. We waited, listening intently. The footsteps continued, slowly, deliberately. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was moving through the house. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's messing around?" I asked, trying to sound brave. No answer. I glanced around at my friends, but they looked just as scared as I felt. We all gathered near the hallway, straining to hear. The sound of footsteps was so close now that I could almost feel them vibrating through the floorboards. One of my friends, Ryan, slowly crept toward the hallway. He mustered the courage to call out, "Hello. Who's there?" No response. The silence after that was deafening. Then, suddenly, the floorboards creaked loudly from the other side of the room, followed by a sharp knock on the wall. We all jumped. "Okay, that's it. Let's get out of here," said Sarah, her voice shaky, but we couldn't leave. The wind had picked up so strongly outside that the front door was now jammed shut. The knocking from the other side of the room persisted, growing louder, like someone was trying to get in. We huddled together in the living room, terrified. We thought about calling the police, but none of us had a signal on our phones. The atmosphere was thick with dread. Then, the lights flickered, and the knocking stopped. A cold breeze swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight. I looked toward the front door. It was slightly ajar. I swear it hadn't been when we had last checked. We moved as a group, cautiously toward the door. Ryan tried to close it, but the handle wouldn't turn. He pulled harder. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut with a violent bang. We screamed, and then, the voice came soft at first, but growing louder. "Let me in," it whispered. We all froze. The voice wasn't coming from outside the door, though. It was coming from inside the cabin. The voice seemed to echo through the walls, reverberating all around us. I was about to turn and run when I noticed something strange. The air near the fireplace seemed to shimmer. At first, I thought it was the heat from the flames, but then I saw an outline, like a figure standing in the doorway. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, barely above a whisper. Everyone nodded, their faces pale and wide-eyed. We had to leave. But how? I ran toward the back door, desperate to find a way out, but as soon as I opened it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark figure was standing in the yard, just beyond the threshold, watching us. I slammed the door shut and turned to my friends. We were trapped, and that's when the whispering started again, louder, clearer. "Let me in." It was the same voice as before, but now it sounded closer, as if it was right behind me. We all bolted for the front door, desperate to escape. When we opened it, the wind howled, and we ran out into the woods without looking back. We made it to our car, heartbeats racing. As we drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, just watching us leave. I'll never forget that feeling of being watched. We made it out, but that place wasn't empty. Something had been there with us the entire time. Something that was still waiting for us to return, and I don't think it will ever stop. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the grind. My friends and I rented a secluded cabin in the woods, far from civilization, expecting nothing more than fresh air and quiet nights. What we got was far from peaceful. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the trees when we unloaded our gear. The cabin looked like something out of a horror movie with peeling paint and a crooked porch. But it was spacious and isolated, and we were eager to escape our hectic lives. The first night was uneventful. We cooked, laughed, and played games around the fire pit. The woods were quiet, almost a quiet. A strange kind of stillness hung in the air, but I thought nothing of it. It was just the isolation. Around midnight, we decided to head inside. I was in the bedroom on the second floor, alone. The others had their own rooms, and I preferred the privacy. I could hear them talking downstairs, but their voices were soon drowned out by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard a faint scratching noise. It was soft at first, almost like a branch tapping against the window. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, more rhythmic, like something or someone was scraping at the wall outside. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or an animal. But the sound didn't stop. It seemed deliberate, as if it were trying to get my attention. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I sat up in bed, listening. It was closer now, right outside the window. A loud thud made me jump. Then came a voice, soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't clear, but it was close. Too close. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding, and pressed my face to the glass. The night was pitch black, no moon, no stars. I saw nothing, only shadows and trees. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." I backed away from the window, terrified. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. I was alone upstairs, and the rest of my friends were downstairs, too far away to hear anything. What if it was someone playing a prank? But the voice sounded wrong, too low, too guttural. I grabbed my phone to call one of my friends, but I had no signal. Panic crept in as the voice came again, this time with a low, scraping laugh. I was paralyzed with fear. Should I check outside? Should I wake everyone up? I stayed still, straining to hear any sound, but everything fell silent. No wind, no scratching, nothing. I waited in the dark, my ears ringing with the silence. But after what felt like an eternity, the voice came once more, only this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the room. I heard a faint rustling behind me, and I spun around to face the door. The door was slightly ajar, as I had left it when I went to bed. But now, the space between the door and the frame was too wide, like something was pushing it open from the other side. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I heard the scraping again, this time from the far corner of the room, near the closet. My legs moved before I could even think, and I bolted from the room, down the stairs, and into the living room where the others were still gathered, oblivious to what had happened. I rushed in, shutting the door behind me. I couldn't speak at first, just gasping for air. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, looking at me with concern. I had heard something. Someone outside the window, then inside. I stammered. I could see that my face was pale, and I knew I was shaking. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked skeptically. "You probably just heard an animal. You're freaking out," but I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We all stayed up for the rest of the night, but nothing else happened. The wind had died down, and the air felt thick, oppressive, like the cabin was holding its breath. By morning, I convinced myself it was all my imagination. That morning, as we prepared to leave, I noticed something strange. There were long, scratch-like marks on the windowsill. I bent down to look closer, and to my horror, I saw that the marks weren't made by any animal. They were human-shaped, like fingers dragging down the wood. The others didn't notice, and I didn't want to scare them, so I didn't say anything. But as we walked out, I saw the final detail, a handprint pressed against the glass from the outside, smeared with something dark. We left the cabin quickly, and I didn't look back. But to this day, I can't forget that voice, those eyes I never saw, and the feeling that something followed us out of that place. And sometimes, when the wind picks up, I swear I hear a faint whisper, calling me from the dark. We had been planning the weekend getaway for weeks, a group of 6 friends eager to escape city life. The cabin was located in a secluded forest, far from any distractions. When we arrived, the air was fresh, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine. We quickly settled in, enjoying the isolation and the silence of the surrounding woods. That first night, we stayed up late by the fire, drinking and chatting. It was peaceful, and none of us noticed anything strange. But around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a loud sound that disturbed me, just a low, almost imperceptible scraping noise. It was coming from outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought it might be a branch rubbing against the glass, but as I listened, it didn't sound like wind or nature. It sounded deliberate, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. I sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I turned on the lamp and got out of bed, the floorboards creaking under my feet. I stood by the window for a few moments, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing, just the dim outline of trees swaying in the wind. The noise had stopped. Relieved, I climbed back into bed, trying to calm my nerves, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept drifting back to the strange scraping sound. It wasn't until I heard a knock, soft at first, that I sat bolt upright. Frozen, I crept to the door and opened it, scanning the hallway. Empty, quiet, everyone was still asleep. The knocking came again, louder this time, and it wasn't from the door, it was from downstairs, near the front door. A sudden chill swept over me. I couldn't explain why, but the atmosphere felt different, heavy, as though something was watching me. I debated waking everyone up, but I was terrified of what I might find if I did. So, I did nothing, just stood there in the hallway, listening. The knocking persisted, and the sound of dragging seemed to follow. I could hear it moving across the floorboards beneath me, slowly, with purpose. I don't know how much time passed before I finally gathered the courage to tiptoe downstairs. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon through the windows. My breath quickened as I approached the living room. When I turned the corner, I froze. The front door was wide open. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the empty doorway, unable to move. The cold air rushed in from outside, making the hairs on my neck stand up. It was too dark to see what was out there, but I felt something was out there. I rushed back up the stairs, woke everyone up, and told them what had happened. They all thought I was overreacting. They were convinced I had just imagined it, maybe the wind or some animal. We checked the door and locked it again, but the strange feeling never left. Everyone went back to bed, though I couldn't sleep a wink. I kept hearing that scraping sound, the knocking, faint but persistent. In the morning, everything felt off. The air was still thick with unease, and no one could shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something hadn't before. They were muddy footprints leading up to the open door, but they didn't stop there. They continued, spreading throughout the entire cabin, but they weren't human. They were too big. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. Everyone was eager to leave, and I didn't want to freak anyone out. We left the cabin without a second glance, but the unease stayed with me. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the worst part. When I looked in the mirror, I saw something on my neck, small, dark marks, almost like scratches, forming a circle. It looked as though something had been trying to grab me, but I hadn't felt it. I never told anyone about that. But now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that cabin never really left. Every night, I hear the scraping sound again, just outside my window. And sometimes, when I wake up, I think I see the shadow of something standing in the doorway, waiting for me to open it, waiting for me to let it in. I've always been the type to question everything. Ghost stories, folklore, I never bought into it. But all of that changed one night when I went on a camping trip with my friends. We decided to head out to a remote spot deep in the woods. No signal, no distractions, just a place to disconnect and unwind. I didn't know much about the area, but my friend Adam, who organized the trip, assured us it was perfect. Isolated, quiet, peaceful, he'd said. It sounded great. We arrived late, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, and quickly set up our tents by a small clearing. The air was crisp, and there was an eerie stillness that blanketed the woods. The fire crackled as we sat around it, laughing and telling stories. But, as the night dragged on, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the kind of stillness you associate with peace. It was a thick, oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on you. Around midnight, we all retired to our tents. I had trouble sleeping, the quiet gnawing at me like a weight on my chest. At some point, I heard what I thought was someone walking around outside my tent. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something, but then came a sound that froze me cold, a soft knock on my tent. I held my breath. I couldn't believe it. The knock came again, slower this time, more deliberate. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, not daring to move. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, a whisper, "Let me in." I nearly suffocated on my own breath. The voice was quiet, almost inaudible, but clear enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a woman's voice, thin and breathless, like it was coming from just outside the tent. My mind raced. Could it be one of my friends? I waited, counting the seconds before I unzipped the tent, but before I could, the whisper came again, this time closer. "Let me in." I quickly checked my phone. No signal. I didn't know what to do, so just stayed there, frozen in place. The knocking stopped, but the whispering didn't. It lingered, filling the space around me. I wanted to scream, but the fear locked my throat. After what felt like hours, the whispers faded, and the night returned to its suffocating silence. I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to every movement in the forest, wondering if someone was out there. When morning came, I was drained, but I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but when I emerged from my tent, I noticed something. The ground around our campsite was disturbed, footprints leading in a circle, as if someone had been walking around our tents all night. And they weren't human. The shape of the prints was all wrong, too large, too deep. I didn't tell the others about what had happened. But Adam, ever the skeptic, had a theory. He had read some stuff about the area, he said. It was an old legend about a woman who had gone missing in these woods. She was said to roam the forest, looking for anyone foolish enough to venture near. The way Adam described it sounded ridiculous, but as he talked, I began to feel like I was being watched again. We spent the rest of the day exploring the woods, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But that night, the feeling returned. We gathered around the campfire, but none of us spoke much. The atmosphere felt heavy, like something was about to happen. And then it did. From the woods, we heard a rustling. It started faint, but then grew louder, closer. My heart pounded as I turned to the others, but no one had heard it. Adam was already standing, flashlight in hand. He was about to speak when a shadow moved just outside the circle of light. I saw it clearly. A figure, hunched over, moving quickly among the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with its face hidden in shadow. It stopped for a moment, and in that instant, the air grew colder. Then, it disappeared into the dark. We didn't hesitate. We packed up everything and rushed to the car. No one said a word, but I could feel the fear settling in. As we drove away, I looked back at the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. A week later, Adam sent me a message. He had done some more research about the area. The missing woman, he said, had been found years later, wandering the same woods. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and her last words were, "They're still out there, waiting." I can't explain it, but that night, whatever we saw in the woods, it wasn't human, and I don't think it ever left. I never thought anything could scare me like that night did. I was working the night shift at a small, 24-hour gas station, the kind that has the flickering neon sign and a single, worn-out bench for people to sit on. The station was in a town that felt abandoned at the dark, a place where the only noise was the wind rattling the old gas pumps and the occasional truck that drove through on the way to somewhere else. It was around 3 a.m. when the first strange thing happened. A black sedan pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin daggers. The sedan sat there for a moment too long, then pulled forward slowly, as if waiting for something. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe the driver was waiting for a friend. Maybe he was just tired. But then I noticed it, a shadow flitting across the windshield, moving so fast that I wasn't sure if I'd seen it at all. My heart thumped louder as I took a breath. Trying to steady myself, the car suddenly jerked forward, headlights flashing briefly in my direction before it sped off into the darkness. I watched it disappear down the long, empty road, my pulse pounding in my ears. Just as I was about to turn back to my work, I heard a noise behind me, shuffling. like someone was dragging their feet across the cracked tile floor. I turned sharply, eyes wide. The place was empty except for me. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went back to stocking the shelves, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The night felt heavier, like something was pressing down on my chest. It was nearing 4 a.m. when the next car pulled in. This one was an old, rusty pickup truck, the kind that looked like it should have been retired decades ago. I looked out at it, the driver's side door creaking open slowly. But again, no one stepped out. I stepped back from the counter, heart slamming into my ribs as I stared at the open door. Then I saw him, a man, hunched over, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. He shuffled toward the door of the gas station, eyes locked on mine, and I realized too late that he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows of the truck bed, I saw a second figure, its shape more like an elongated, cloud shadow than anything human. My hands went cold, and a shiver raced down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as the man reached for the door handle. A high-pitched, inhuman screech split the silence, and I jumped, grabbing the phone from the counter and dialing 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency? Came the voice on the other end. I couldn't speak, couldn't tear my eyes away as the first man's mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. The shadow behind him stepped forward, and in the bright neon light, I saw its true form, a twisted, half-human shape, dripping with something dark and glistening. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were black and hollow, filled with a cold, infinite hunger. The dispatcher's voice brought me back to reality. Sir, are you there? What's happening? I opened my mouth to scream, but couldn't make a sound. The figures outside the window were moving, circling the building, and I knew I had only moments before they found a way in. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. I ducked behind the counter and waited, hearing the slapping sound of wet feet on tile as they moved closer. Then everything went silent. The silence was worse than any noise, and I knew that something had changed. I stood up cautiously and peeked over the counter, my chest aching with every breath. The gas station was empty. No figures, no strange sounds, just the hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the clock on the wall. The phone in my hand felt hot, like it had a pulse of its own. I could still hear the dispatcher on the line, asking if I was okay. I nodded, a shaky laugh escaping me as I whispered, "I'm okay now." But as I looked out the window, I noticed something chilling. The black sedan was back, parked across the street, engine idling. I stared at the rearview mirror, where a face stared back at me with eyes as hollow and dark as the figure that had been outside. They were still here. I had never been a fan of large gatherings, but when my cousin invited me to her annual summer party at the family vineyard, I couldn't say no. The sprawling estate sat atop a rolling hill, its vineyards glistening under the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of sweet grapes and dry earth, and the distant hum of cicadas added a layer of calm to the scene. The party was in full swing when I arrived. Laughter echoed from the patio where friends and family mingled, glasses clinking as they toasted. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging greetings and grabbing a glass of chilled white wine. As the sun began to set, golden light spilled across the rows of grapevines, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to reach for me. I wandered away from the main gathering, wanting a moment of solitude. The vineyard was beautiful at dusk, the sky streaked with hues of pink and purple. But as I walked deeper into the maze of vines, the air turned cooler, the buzz of the party fading behind me. I turned a corner and found myself at the edge of a small clearing. In the center was an old, rusted metal bench with ivy growing through its slats. I sat down, taking a deep breath as I watched the sky darken. It was then that I noticed a soft, rhythmic thudding sound coming from somewhere nearby. I stood up and looked around, trying to place the noise. It wasn't the wind, it was something much more deliberate. The thumping came again, louder now, from the direction of the old barn at the edge of the vineyard. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started toward it, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet the only sound as I walked. The barn was huge, with weathered wooden doors and broken shutters. I pushed one door open, just enough to peek inside. The dim light revealed dusty barrels, empty crates, and old farming tools. But it was what I heard next that made my blood run cold. A soft, wheezing laugh coming from deep within the shadows. Hello. My voice trembled as I stepped further in. The laughter stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The air grew heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. Suddenly, the barn door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, as the latch clicked into place. I pounded on the wood, shouting for someone to help me. No answer. I reached into my pocket for my phone, only to find it dead, the screen dark and unresponsive. I turned back to the barn's interior, searching for a way out. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the far end, half hidden in shadow. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural angles. Its head tilted to the side, and I caught a glimpse of its face pale, hollow-eyed, with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. Before I could scream, it moved. The sound of its uneven footsteps sent a jolt of terror through me as I backed away. The barn was suddenly filled with that same wheezing laugh, a sound so jarring I felt it reverberate through my bones. I grabbed a nearby pitchfork and held it out in front of me, the metal cold and trembling in my grip. I charged at the figure, swinging with all the strength I had. The pitchfork sliced through the air and met nothing but thin, cold mist. The figure dissolved before my eyes, leaving only the stench of rotting grapes and the sound of the party outside. The barn door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the night air, gasping. The vineyard was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked back at the barn, the window was dark, and I could swear I saw a pair of hollow eyes watching me from inside. I never spoke of it to anyone, but every year, when the summer party rolls around, I can't help but remember the night I heard that laugh and felt the icy touch of something that wasn't supposed to be there. We started our hike early, the sun just beginning to climb above the horizon, painting everything in soft hues of pink and gold. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with the kind of crisp air that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, and we made good time. The cliffs loomed ahead, their jagged edges sharp against the sky. By noon, we reached the highest point. We stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. Below, the ocean stretched out endlessly, its deep blue surface dotted with white caps. The rocks beneath our feet were slippery, but we were careful. There was no real danger, just awe at how wild and beautiful the world could be. We ate lunch on the cliffs, chatting about everything and nothing, when the first odd thing happened. At the far end of the cliff, just out of sight from where we were sitting, there was a figure. It wasn't someone from our group. This person was standing motionless, facing the ocean, a dark silhouette against the light. I squinted, trying to make out details, but they were too far away. I mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed it off. Probably someone else out here, Mark said. Lots of people hike this spot, but it felt strange. The figure didn't move, not even to adjust their posture, just standing still, unmoving. I turned away, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It wasn't until we finished eating and packed up to leave that the figure became more troubling. We hadn't seen them leave, and the spot they were standing in was still empty. But the odd thing was, we now found fresh footprints in the dirt, footprints that led directly to the cliff's edge. I could tell they were recent, still deep and dark in the dirt, like someone had been standing right there only moments before. We followed the trail, but it led nowhere. The cliffs dropped sharply into the ocean below, with nothing but jagged rocks and a vast emptiness stretching out. There was no way the person could have just walked off the edge. It didn't make sense. I didn't say anything at the time, but the unease was growing in me. There was something wrong here. The longer I looked at the prints, the more unsettled I became. They didn't seem like the footprints of someone who had been hiking. They were too deliberate, too precise, like they had been placed there for a reason. I tried to push it out of my mind, but as we began heading back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. My skin prickled with an invisible tension. We continued, laughing and talking, but I kept looking over my shoulder. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, we began to make our way back toward the parking area. That's when I saw it again, the same figure. This time, they were not far from us, standing in the shadow of a large rock. Their back was to us, but I could see something clearly. They were holding something in their hands, something I couldn't identify. but it was too big and too unnatural to ignore. I stopped walking, and my friends turned to look at me. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "There's someone over there," I said, pointing. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The space was empty. "Stop messing with us," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "There's no one there," but I was sure. I'd seen it clearly. My heart began to race. I wanted to leave, to get back to the car and drive far away from this place, but something made me stop. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. We reached the parking area just as the sun was setting. It was a small, gravel lot with a single path leading to the main road. As we neared the cars, I heard a sound, a low, grating noise, like something scraping against stone. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing behind us except the dense trees and the empty, silent cliff. But then, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint, carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. The voice was saying my name. I froze. It wasn't one of my friends. It was a voice I didn't recognize, soft but clear, as if it had been waiting for me to hear it. "Don't leave." I snapped around to face my friends, but they were already piling into the cars, unaware of the chill that had run down my spine. I didn't tell them what I'd heard. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just wanted to get out of there. We left the cliffs, the strange voice still echoing in my mind. The car ride back was quiet, everyone too exhausted to talk. But when I got home later, that night, I noticed something on my phone, a new notification, a picture. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, standing on the edge of the cliffs. But I was alone in the photo. The figure was nowhere to be seen. And then, I noticed something chilling in the background. There was someone else in the shadows, just out of view, watching me from a distance. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon as I walked back from the market, the light splintering through the trees and casting long, jagged shadows on the gravel path. I had spent the day on the farm, helping out with chores and picking up supplies. The farm belonged to an old couple who lived at the far end of the property, and I had agreed to run their errands while they rested. The path I was on led through a dense section of woods, a shortcut that shaved off nearly half a mile. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their leaves like dark, jagged teeth against the deepening sky. The woods were never truly silent, but tonight there was something else, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the direction of the clearing. I paused, my fingers tightening around the handle of my basket. The thumping continued, steady and deep, like the sound of something heavy being struck over and over. I took a breath, telling myself it was probably just the wind moving the branches. But the air felt thick and close, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. My footfalls quickened as I pressed on, each step sounding louder in the stillness. The path narrowed, the woods seeming to lean in around me like watchful eyes. I glanced behind me, heart skipping a beat as I caught sight of something at the edge of the woods, a figure standing just beyond the trees, hidden in the deepening shadows. The thumping sound grew louder now, closer, as if whatever was making it was moving along the path toward me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my basket as a sharp, bone-chilling scream split the air. It was human but distorted, like it had been pulled through a funnel of raw static. My blood froze in my veins. I turned and sprinted, feet pounding on the gravel as I pushed through the brambles and thorns that clawed at my skin. The scream sounded again, closer, louder, until it was a banshee wail echoing in my ears. I didn't dare look back, focusing instead on the pale glow of the farm's porch light ahead. My breath was ragged by the time I reached the clearing. The porch light blinked on, its yellow hue casting an eerie glow across the yard. I ran up to the front door and hammered on it, eyes darting to the woods behind me, expecting to see something emerge. The sound of the thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep silence that seemed almost deafening. The door creaked open, and the old man peered out, eyes wide with concern. I tried to catch my breath, but the words caught in my throat. He put a hand on my shoulder, guiding me inside, away from the oppressive night. "Are you all right, dear?" he asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. I wanted to tell him what I'd heard, what I'd seen, but my voice had turned to ashes. Just then, there was a knock at the back door, sharp and urgent. We both turned to look at it, the old man's face draining of color. "Who's there?" he called out, but there was no response, just a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. A cold, clammy hand touched my arm from behind, and I spun around, my vision blurring with tears of panic. But there was nothing there. The knock came again, louder this time, as if whatever was at the door was pushing against it, testing its strength. The old man reached for the key hanging by the door, but I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. I glanced out the small window by the door and caught sight of a figure in the moonlight, too far to make out clearly, but the eyes cold and unblinking stared straight at me. The scream came again, not from the woods, but from right outside the door, the sound making my ears feel like they were going to split open. The old man's hands trembled as he unlocked the door, and I knew then that whatever was out there wasn't something that could be kept out. The door swung open, revealing nothing but night, and in that silence, a voice rasped, barely audible, "Let me in." It wasn't the old man's voice. It wasn't human. I backed away, clutching the basket to my chest as the light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The scream, now a whisper, seemed to seep through the walls as the door slammed shut behind me. The knocking stopped. The old library was as quiet as a tomb, but that was part of its charm. It was an ancient building with towering shelves that groaned under the weight of hundreds of thousands of books. I loved it, despite its creaking floors and dim, flickering lights. It was the one place I felt truly at peace, away from the noise and chaos of the world. I'd been working there as a night custodian for months, a job that suited me perfectly. On this particular night, I was finishing my last sweep of the upper floor, the one with the old, leather-bound volumes. The air was heavy with the scent of paper and dust, and the silence seemed almost to press against my eardrums. I just rounded a corner when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone's nails drumming against a desk. I paused, peering into the shadows. The sound had come from the far end of the room, where the dim light barely reached. I should have told myself it was just my imagination, but the chill creeping up my spine told me otherwise. My heart pounded as I moved toward the noise, each step louder than the last in the oppressive silence. As I neared the sound, the tapping stopped abruptly. I stopped too, breath caught in my throat. The library was as still as before, except now I could hear my own heartbeat, echoing in the empty room. I glanced around nervously, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into my back. That's when I saw it. A book, on a pedestal near the window, was open, its pages fluttering as though someone had just turned them. But there was no breeze. I took a cautious step forward, eyes fixed on the book. The words written in old, spidery script seemed to twist and rearrange before my eyes, forming a sentence that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here." I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned to run, but a low, guttural growl stopped me in my tracks. The growl came from the direction of the rows of bookshelves, the sound of something heavy moving through the dark. My mind raced as I strained to see what was there. I caught a glimpse of something dark, with too many limbs and eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. It was as if the creature was made from the pages of the books themselves, its form shifting and warping in a grotesque dance. I sprinted toward the stairs, my fingers fumbling for the keys on my belt. My heart was in my throat as I threw open the exit door, slamming it behind me and locking it as fast as I could. The growl continued, but now it was muffled, fading behind the thick, old wood. I stood there in the dark hallway, gasping for air, sweat pouring down my face. The echo of the creature's movements seemed to reverberate in my bones, even through the closed door. I stumbled back, barely keeping my balance, and caught my reflection in a window. My eyes were wide, my pupils dilated, but then I saw it, a shadow, dark and thin, creeping across the glass from the inside. My pulse skyrocketed as I felt an icy, bony hand rest on my shoulder. I whipped around to find no one there. The library was silent again, but I knew better now. It was waiting, watching, and it knew my fear. I stumbled toward the exit, never taking my eyes off the dark windows. That night, I learned the hard way that some places keep their secrets locked between their pages, waiting for a visitor foolish enough to read them, and I was never going back.